Hello there, and welcome to this relaxing bedtime story exploring some of the most unpleasant professions in the land of the pharaohs. I'm so glad you've joined me for this journey into ancient Egyptian history. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy meandering, tranquil tales like this, please consider subscribing for more soothing excursions into the past. Now, make yourself comfortable, snuggle up in your coziest blanket, and let your mind wander back in time with me to the banks of the Nile around 2500 BC. The sun is just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The great river is smooth as glass, mirroring the colours above. Farmers are already out in their fields, tending to the fertile black soil that is both the lifeblood and livelihood of Egypt. At first glance, all seems picturesque and idyllic, an ancient civilization at peace under the godlike rule of the pharaoh. For the lucky few, the royal family, nobles and priests, life is indeed rather pleasant, with days spent in cool, painted villas, enjoying the finest foods and being waited on hand and foot by servants. But for the multitudes of common folk, daily existence requires toil, grit, and a strong stomach. Over the centuries, Egypt will achieve wonders: the pyramids that pierce the sky, colossal temples to the gods, complex systems of writing and trade. But behind those marvels are the humble labourers who haul the stones, dig the ditches, and collect the taxes that keep the kingdom running. Tonight, we'll meet some of those unsung figures and discover what it was really like to perform the toughest and most stomach-turning jobs in ancient Egypt. But don't worry, I'll spare you the gorier details so you can start to relax and unwind. Let the lapping of the Nile's waters and the distant bleating of goats lull you into a calm, sleepy state. We have a long journey ahead of us tonight, so there's no need to rush. Take a deep breath in, release any tension you're holding onto, and sink a little deeper into your pillow. Our first stop is the embalming tent, where we'll meet a young man assisting in the mummification process. The preservation of the dead is a sacred art in Egypt, but as we'll soon discover, it's not a job for the faint of heart. The year is 2550 BC, and under a stretched linen awning at the edge of the desert lies the body of a recently deceased nobleman. The chief embalmer, a distinguished priest of Anubis, is gently removing the corpse's brain through the nose with a long, hooked tool. Assisting him is his young nephew Amos, who shifts uneasily as he watches. Amos had always dreamed of following in his uncle's footsteps and joining the prestigious ranks of royal embalmers. But now that he's finally apprenticing in the mummification workshop, the reality is proving harder to stomach than expected. At just 12 years old, Amos has already seen more of the human body's inner workings than most people glimpse in a lifetime. As his uncle sets aside the brain on a wooden platter, Amos tries to steel himself for the next step. It will be his job to make a cut in the abdomen and remove the organs while his uncle recites prayers. Amos takes a shaky breath, willing his hands not to tremble as he picks up the obsidian blade. The stench of natron salt and frankincense oil fills his nostrils. In this line of work, there can be no hesitation or signs of squeamishness. Amos knows he must put aside his own discomfort and focus on granting this nobleman a chance at eternal life. With a swift, practiced motion, he makes the incision and begins extracting the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines to be dried and placed in sacred canopic jars. As he works, Amos tries to tune out the squelching sounds and slippery sensations, fixing his mind instead on the importance of this ritual. Ancient Egyptians believed that the body must be preserved so the soul has an eternal home. By removing moisture-rich organs that cause decay and drying out the hollow body with salt and resin, Amos and his uncle are allowing the dead to live forever in the field of reeds. This particular mummification will take 70 days to complete. Once Ahmose has finished eviscerating the corpse, he must rinse the body cavity with palm wine and stuff it with sachets of natron, cinnamon, and sawdust. Then linen wrappings will be wound tightly around the limbs, resin dipped and re-wrapped again. Finally, a lifelike portrait mask will be placed over the head so the deceased's soul can recognize its earthly shell. It's intricate, time-consuming, and yes, rather icky work, but Ahmose takes pride in granting the dead their chance at immortality. In the evenings, when he returns to the embalmer's village smelling of salt and musty spices, he knows he has served both Anubis and Osiris well. The weak stomach and stained hands are a small price to pay for being a guide to eternity. Still, as Ahmose lies down to sleep on his reed mat, listening to the far-off howls of jackals in the desert, a part of him sometimes longs for a different path. Perhaps a life spent in the sun and fresh air, even if it meant a more ordinary death. But such thoughts are quickly pushed aside. Ahmose was born into a long line of embalmers, and he will carry on that noble tradition, queasy moments and all. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for young Ahmose and the unusual career he was destined for. Mummification may seem macabre to us now, but for him it was a sacred calling, one that he would slowly grow accustomed to as the years passed, even if he never quite lost that initial uneasiness. The guts and glory of embalming were his birthright and burden to bear. While Ahmose spends his days elbow deep in body cavities, other Egyptians are breaking their backs in the desert heat to construct marvels that will endure for millennia. We turn our attention now to the Giza Plateau, where a revolutionary new tomb design is slowly taking shape, the smooth-sided pyramid. Little does Itju, a farmer-turned-mason, know that he's helping to build one of the world's most iconic structures. Itju squints against the glare of the sun high overhead, his bare shoulders burning and slick with sweat. He and his crew have been hauling limestone blocks since before dawn, maneuvering the massive slabs up a mud-slicked ramp to the ever-growing pyramid of the pharaoh Khufu. At this height, Itju feels like he might as well be constructing a stairway to the sun god Ra himself. The work of a pyramid builder is grueling and repetitive. Chop the blocks from a nearby quarry, heave them onto wooden rollers, and drag them to the build site. Then comes the real backbreaking part, inching each stone up the ramp using levers, mile, and brute force, wedging them tightly together to form the smooth outer faces. Itju can feel the strain in every muscle of his body. He tries to distract himself from the ache by reminding himself how fortunate he is to be part of such a monumental project. When the king's vizier came to Itju's village demanding able-bodied men for the pharaoh's tomb, many feared being wrenched away from their farms and families. But Itju saw an opportunity to serve a higher cause and eat regular meals, even if they were just meager rations of flatbread, onions, and fish. Now, after 2 months of labor, Itju is having second thoughts about his pious enthusiasm. The work is far harder than he ever imagined, and the quota of blocks that must be laid each day is daunting. Khufu is a demanding master, and his overseers don't hesitate to use the lash on sluggish crews. Itju thanks Horus for his strong country boy build that has so far spared him a whipping. He's one of the luckier ones in other ways too. Just yesterday, he witnessed a block slip from a lever and crush the legs of Seneb, the wiry man who works beside him. Seneb's agonized screams still echo in Itju's head. Without the strength to haul stones, Seneb will likely be sent home to his family, no longer useful to the king's grand vision. Itju shudders and redoubles his grip on the lever, determined not to meet a similar fate. He'd rather drop from exhaustion than be crippled far from home. This pyramid is a portal to the afterlife for the pharaoh, but for builders like Itju, it's a test of how much back-breaking labor one man can endure in service to his king's glory. Despite the dangers and discomforts, there is an undeniable awe in watching the smooth-sided tomb rise ever higher, one back-breaking block at a time. Itju may just be an illiterate farmer, but even he can appreciate the mathematical precision and sophisticated engineering that goes into crafting this perfectly proportioned monument. In moments of rest, he finds himself gazing up at the gleaming limestone faces and wondering if the pharaoh's power extends as far into the heavens as his impossible triangle. As the months drag on and Itju's body grows as weathered as the quarry rock, he clings to small comforts: the camaraderie of his crew, the rare days of rest, the knowledge that his labor is ensuring Khufu's eternal life and perhaps securing a measure of his own divine favor. He may just be one man lost in the organized chaos of this great building site, but his sweat is forever mingled with the stones. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine the heat of the desert sun on your shoulders, the grit of limestone dust in your teeth, and the bone-deep fatigue of hauling blocks from dawn to dusk. And feel a twinge of admiration for the tenacity of long-ago laborers like Itju, whose toil and resilience birthed a wonder of the ancient world. Now we turn from the mathematical marvels of the pyramid to the untamed marshes of the Nile Delta, where one man makes his living wrestling creatures that have been both feared and revered since the dawn of history: the Nile crocodile. Capturing these great reptiles is a job that requires equal parts bravery, brawn, and sheer nerve. Shabaka moves silently through the papyrus reeds, his sandaled feet squelching in the soft mud. He can hear the grunting of hippos and the distant honking of geese, but he's listening for a very particular sound: the low, rumbling bellow of a bull crocodile. That's the call that sets Shabaka's heart racing and his calloused hands flexing around his harpoon. He's been hunting crocodiles in these swamps since he was old enough to bait a hook. It's a family trade passed down from his father and grandfather, but no amount of generational wisdom can make tangling with these armored behemoths any less dangerous. One mistake, one slow reflex, and Shabaka knows he could easily end up as just another set of bones settling into the muddy bottom of the Nile. But the thrill of the hunt and the handsome price: live crocodiles fetch from temples, and estate owners keep Shabaka wading into the marshes day after day. The great reptiles are both feared and worshipped in Egypt. They are the living embodiment of Sobek, the sharp-toothed god who lurks in the Nile's depths. Wealthy patrons covet crocodiles as exotic menagerie specimens, and temples keep sacred pools filled with the snapping creatures. And so Shabaka, like his father before him, acts as a go-between, a daring entrepreneur who hauls the revered terrors from their murky home to the gilded realms of priests and princes. It's a livelihood that keeps him lean, scarred, and on the constant lookout for a scaly tail whipping out of the water. Suddenly, a deep bellow reverberates from a nearby stand of reeds, and Shabaka freezes, harpoon at the ready. He spots the telltale bumps of a crocodile's back gliding just above the surface. This one looks to be almost 5 cubits long, with thick-plated scales and a jaw that could snap a man in half. A formidable specimen indeed. Shabaka says a silent prayer to Sobek, takes aim, and lets his harpoon fly with all the strength he can muster. The sharpened point finds its mark, sinking deep into the crocodile's leathery hide. Then, all chaos breaks loose as the enraged reptile begins to thrash and roll, churning the shallow water into a blood-streaked froth. Hanging onto the harpoon rope, Shabaka grits his teeth and digs his heels into the soft riverbed. He can feel the raw power of the crocodile's muscular tail as it whips back and forth. If he loosens his grip for even a second, he'll be dragged under and torn to bits by those merciless teeth. So he holds fast, straining against the beast's fury with all his might. It's a battle of wills and raw strength, man against reptile, with both combatants fighting for their lives. Shabaka, has been in this position countless times before, but the terror and adrenaline is always fresh. There's a reason crocodile wrangling is a job for the boldest and most foolhardy of men. Finally, after what feels like an eternity of struggle, the crocodile begins to tire, its thrashing subsiding into sporadic twitches. Panting and slick with sweat, Shabaka cautiously approaches his vanquished quarry. He binds the great jaws tightly shut with coils of rope and heaves the still twitching carcass over his shoulders. As he slogs back to shore, prizes in tow, Shabaka can feel the sting of new gashes on his arms and chest. The crocodile's claws have left their mark, as they so often do. But to Shabaka, these scars are a badge of honor, proof of his skill and daring in the face of deadly odds. He knows that when he drags his catch back to the city, crowds of onlookers will marvel at the size of the beast and the audacity of its captor. Temple priests will rush to purchase the animal to stock their sacred pools and curry favor with Sobek. For a few days, Shabaka will be hailed as a hero, a man who fearlessly plunges into the demon-haunted marsh and returns with a divine monster in his clutches. But soon enough, the awe will fade, and the grim reality of his unusual trade will reassert itself. There will always be more crocodiles to catch, more risks to take, more scars to bear. And Shabaka will wade back into the swamp, harpoon in hand, to do it all over again. So tonight, as you settle into your soft bed, take a moment to appreciate the simple luxury of a space free of sharp teeth and thrashing tails. And perhaps reserve a bit of grudging respect for rough men like Shabaka, who make their living staring down the throats of Sobek's deadly children. Of course, not all of Egypt's worst jobs involve facing down fearsome beasts or embalming the dead. Some are a slower, more insidious kind of unpleasant, like the life of a copper miner, toiling away in dark, suffocating tunnels to extract the raw materials for Egypt's prize bronze tools and weapons. Deep beneath the sands of the Sinai Desert, Tammuz chisels at a seam of malachite ore, his soot-streaked face illuminated only by the flickering light of an oil lamp. The air down here is hot and thick with rock dust that coats the back of his throat and turns his cough into a rasping hack. But still, he keeps hammering. Tammuz tries not to think about how long he's been underground. Was it 10 days ago that he last glimpsed the sun, or perhaps 12? Time blurs together in the dim, endless tunnels of the copper mine. There is only the ceaseless rhythm of the work. Chip away the ore, gather up the shards, haul the heavy basket to the surface, and begin again. It's a cycle that breaks the body and numbs the mind. Like many of his fellow miners, Tammuz fell into this grim livelihood more out of desperation than choice. When drought wiped out his family's meager crop of barley, he signed on with the mining expedition to keep from starving. At least here there are daily rations of bread and beer, even if they taste of grit and exhaustion. But the cost of those measly provisions is high. The shafts Tammuz now calls home are treacherous places, prone to sudden collapses that bury men alive. The dust that constantly billows from the hammering settles deep in the miner's lungs, leading to racking coughs and a slow, suffocating decline. And always there is the danger of fire damp, the noxious gases that sometimes seep from the rocks and snuff out lives like the spluttering flame of a lamp. As the scorching sun beat down on the bustling city of Thebes, the young embalmer's apprentice Amos hurried through the crowded streets, his stomach churning with anticipation and dread. He had been training under the master embalmer Amenemhat for several months now, learning the intricate art of preparing the dead for their journey into the afterlife. But today, Amos knew he would be assisting with the most unpleasant part of the process, the removal of the organs. He arrived at the embalming workshop, a low mud brick building on the outskirts of the city, and took a deep breath before entering. The pungent odor of natron salt and incense hit him immediately, mingling with the unmistakable smell of decay. In the dim light, Amos could make out the silhouette of Amenemhat hunched over a wooden table, his skilled hands making deft incisions on the corpse before him. "Ah, Amose, you're here," the master embalmer said without looking up. "Come, it's time for you to learn the next step." Amos approached hesitantly, trying to ignore the knot in his gut. On the table lay the body of a middle-aged man, his skin already turning a waxy grey. Amenemhat handed Amos a sharp, bronze knife and nodded towards the corpse. "We must remove the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines," he instructed calmly. "Start with a cut here, under the ribs." Amos's hand shook slightly as he positioned the blade, but he made the incision as carefully as he could. As he began to extract the organs one by one, the apprentice fought back a wave of nausea. The slick, rubbery feel of the intestines, the overwhelming stench. It was almost too much to bear, but Ahmosi persevered, reminding himself of the vital role he played in ensuring the deceased's successful passage to the afterlife. As the hours wore on and the canopic jars were filled, Ahmose found himself settling into a sort of grim rhythm. His hands moved more surely, his breathing became more even. Amenemhat watched approvingly, offering guidance and correction when needed. By the time they had finished packing the body cavity with fabric and natron for drying, Amos felt a small sense of accomplishment alongside his exhaustion and queasiness. Over the following months and years, Amos would assist in countless more embalmings, gradually mastering the techniques of his trade. He learned to remove the brain through the nostrils with a hooked implement, to carefully place the shriveled organs in their respective canopic jars, each one guarded by a different deity. He became adept at wrapping the desiccated bodies in hundreds of yards of linen, encasing them in a cocoon of protection for the ages. Yet even as his skills grew, Amos never quite lost his aversion to the more macabre aspects of his work. The squelch of decaying flesh, the ever-present spectre of death, it clung to him like a persistent odor. Some nights he would dream of the faces of the deceased, their sunken eyes and gaping mouths pleading wordlessly. But Ahmose took solace in the knowledge that his efforts ensured a chance at eternal life for those in his care. He took pride in upholding Ma'at, the proper order of the universe, through his diligent service. And on the rare occasions when he was called upon to embalm a particularly illustrious individual, perhaps even a member of the royal family, Amos felt a quiet thrill at being entrusted with such a weighty responsibility. As he grew older and began to train apprentices of his own, Amos would often reflect on his early days in the embalming workshop, the visceral shock of that first extraction still vivid in his memory. He knew that his was not a calling for the faint of heart, that it required a certain fortitude of spirit to confront mortality so intimately day after day. But Amos also knew that he played an essential role in the grand tapestry of Egyptian life and death, ensuring that the legacy of his people would endure for eternity. And so he continued his work with grim determination, his hands steady and his heart resolute, a master of his morbid craft. Far from the shadowed chambers of the embalmers, another sort of grim labor was taking place under the blazing Egyptian sun. For decades, the pharaoh Khufu had been marshalling his resources and manpower to construct a monument that would stand the test of time, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Among the tens of thousands of workers toiling on this massive project was a young peasant named Itju. Like many of his fellows, Itju had been conscripted from his village to serve in the king's workforce, leaving behind his family and his small plot of land along the Nile. Now, his days were filled with the ceaseless labor of hauling limestone blocks up the ever-growing pyramid's ramps. From dawn to dusk, Itju and his team would strain under the weight of the massive stones, each one weighing as much as 2.5 tons. They heaved and hauled, their muscles burning and their skins slick with sweat under the merciless sun. The work was relentless, backbreaking, with scarcely a moment to rest or take a sip of water from the skin bags they carried. Itju's hands quickly became raw and blistered from gripping the rough ropes, his body perpetually sore and exhausted. He subsisted on meager rations of bread, onions, and the occasional dried fish, barely enough to sustain him through the grueling days. At night, he would collapse into his cramped shared quarters, too tired even to dream of his distant home and family. As the years wore on and the pyramid rose higher and higher, Itju witnessed the toll the work took on those around him. He saw men crushed beneath tumbling blocks, their broken bodies carried away on stretchers. He watched as fellow labourers succumbed to exhaustion and dehydration, collapsing where they stood. And he knew that he too was not immune to the dangers of the build site. Once, while navigating a narrow ledge high up on the pyramid's face, Itju lost his footing, his heart lurching into his throat as he began to plummet towards the unforgiving ground far below. By some miracle, he managed to catch himself on an outcropping at the last moment, clinging to the limestone with trembling fingers until his teammates could haul him to safety. From that day on, Itju was all too aware of how easily his life could be snuffed out, just another casualty in the pharaoh's grand vision. But despite the hardships and the dangers, Itju found a certain camaraderie among his fellow workers. They looked out for one another, sharing what little food and water they had, telling stories and jokes to keep their spirits up during the long, grueling days. In a way, they became a sort of family united by their shared suffering and their pride in the monumental task they were undertaking. And so, year after year, Itju hauled and heaved, his body growing lean and weathered, his hands permanently calloused. He watched as the pyramid rose block by block, tier by tier, until it towered over the desert landscape, like a man-made mountain. He marveled at the precision of the limestone casing stones, fitted so seamlessly that not even a blade could be inserted between them. Finally, after nearly 3 decades of toil, the Great Pyramid was complete. As Itju stood before the finished monument, his body aching and his spirit weary, he felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Pride, certainly, at having played a part in creating such a wonder. Relief that his long ordeal was finally at an end. But also a profound sense of insignificance in the face of such a colossal achievement, the work of countless nameless hands like his own. Itju knew that he would likely never see his home village again, that his remaining days would be spent in the shadow of the pyramid he had helped to build. But as he gazed up at the gleaming limestone faces, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of orange and gold, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into this monument, had given the best years of his life to its construction, and though his name would never be recorded in the annals of history, Itju knew that in some small way he had achieved a kind of immortality. For as long as the Great Pyramid endured, as long as it continued to inspire awe and wonder in the hearts of those who beheld it, a part of him would endure too, woven into the very fabric of this timeless marvel. And so Itju turned his face towards the sunset, his weathered features etched with a quiet acceptance, and prepared to meet whatever fate the gods had in store for him, content in the knowledge that he had played his part in the great drama of Egypt's destiny. As the sun rose over the Nile, its golden rays illuminated the bustling streets of Thebes. The city was already alive with activity as merchants set up their stalls in the marketplace, and artisans began their daily work in the workshops. But for some, the day held a grimmer purpose. Amos, a young embalmer's apprentice, made his way through the waking city towards the temple of Anubis. Under his arm, he carried a set of freshly cleaned linens and natron salts, the tools of his macabre trade. Though he had been training in the art of mummification for several months now, Amos still felt a queasy unease every time he entered the embalming chamber. The pungent odor of frankincense and myrrh did little to mask the underlying stench of death that permeated the temple halls. In the flickering light of oil lamps, Amos set down his supplies and looked upon the body laid out on the stone slab before him. It was a noble woman, her once vibrant face now slack and lifeless. Amos's mentor, the chief embalmer Carr, emerged from the shadows. "Ah, you're here. Good," he said brusquely. "Today you will assist in removing her organs. Watch closely." With deft, practiced motions, Carr made an incision in the woman's left side and reached into the cavity. Amos felt his stomach churn as Carr methodically extracted the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, setting each organ aside to be individually preserved. Sweat beaded on Amos's brow, though the chamber was cool and dark. "Now the heart," said Carr, his voice clinical. "This, of course, we leave in place. The heart is the seat of thought and feeling and must remain for the deceased to be whole in the afterlife." Amos nodded weakly. Though he knew the process was necessary for the soul to live on, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong about violating the body's sanctity in this way. Carr must have sensed his apprentice's discomfort. "It is an honor to prepare the dead for their eternal journey," he said solemnly. "We are the guardians of their immortality. Never forget the sacred nature of what we do, even in the midst of the unpleasant necessities." Amos took a shaky breath and tried to steel himself. He knew Carr was right. This was a vital role, even if a grim one. For the ancient Egyptians, the afterlife was as real and important as the living world, and it was the embalmer's solemn duty to ensure the deceased arrived there intact. Amos picked up a fresh linen shroud and stepped forward to assist Carr in wrapping the organs. As they worked in silence, Amos gradually felt his unease transform into a sense of purpose. Yes, this job was macabre, stomach-churning, emotionally heavy, but it was also profoundly meaningful. Through his efforts, this noblewoman and countless others would live on in the field of reeds, navigating the trials of the duat with an immortal body to house an eternal soul. Amos was not just a simple craftsman, he was a sculptor of forever, an architect of eternity. Hours later, the woman's mummified form lay complete, her body preserved and ready for its sarcophagus. Carr nodded approvingly at Amos's work. "You did well today," he said, laying a hand on the young man's shoulder. "In time, your hands will be as steady as mine, and your heart as certain of our purpose." Amos managed a small smile. He would never grow to love the more visceral aspects of his work, but he was beginning to understand its profound importance. He gathered up the remaining linens and salts and followed Carr out of the embalming chamber, leaving the newly minted mummy to begin her timeless sleep. As they emerged into the bright sunlight, Amos squinted against the glare. All around him, the living city hummed with activity. Merchants haggling, children laughing, donkeys braying. And yet, in the temple behind him, the dead also teemed, silently waiting for their journey to the afterlife. Amos paused for a moment to marvel at this strange duality that defined his world. The Egypt of the living and the Egypt of the dead, eternally intertwined through the ceaseless efforts of people like him. With a sigh, Amos set off down the street towards his next grim task, his heart heavy, but his purpose clear. In a society so focused on eternity, even the most macabre of jobs had a vital part to play in the cosmic dance of life, death, and rebirth. Amos knew his role, and he would perform it with all the skill and reverence it deserved, no matter how much his stomach might churn. As the day wore on, the oppressive heat bore down on the workers hauling limestone blocks up the stepped sides of the rising pyramid of Pharaoh Khafra. The air shimmered with haze, obscuring the top of the massive monument that Itju and his fellow labourers toiled ceaselessly to construct. Itju paused for a moment, Setting down his heavy block and straightening his aching back, he squinted up at the pyramid, trying to gauge how much further they had to go. The summit was lost in the shimmering distance, seeming to recede away the longer he looked at it. Itju sighed heavily. Some days it felt like this monumental work would never be done. "Keep moving!" barked the overseer, his whip cracking uncomfortably close to Itju's ear. "The pharaoh's tomb waits for no man's rest." Itju picked up his burden once more, his muscles screaming in protest. He had been at this back-breaking labor for months now, ever since he had been conscripted from his village during the last flooding of the Nile. At first, he had marveled at the great construction project, awed by the architectural ambition and engineering prowess on display. But as the weeks wore on and the toil took its toll, Itju's wonder had gradually transmuted into a bone-deep weariness. The work was relentless, and the conditions brutal. The men labored from dawn to dusk, with only brief respites for meager meals of bread, beer, and onions. They slept in cramped, squalid quarters at the base of the construction site, their bodies packed together like so many salted fish. Injuries were common: crushed limbs from tumbling blocks, broken bones from falls, gashes from sharp copper chisels. Itju himself bore a long scar down his leg from a near miss with a falling chunk of limestone. And yet, day after day, they persisted. The pyramid inched ever upwards, the fruits of their ceaseless labor. Itju couldn't help but feel a strange sort of pride in his exhausted misery. He was part of something greater than himself, a monument that would endure for all eternity. Long after his weary bones had crumbled to dust, the pharaoh would live on in this mighty tomb, ready to stride into the afterlife. At times, that thought was all that kept Itju going, that and the camaraderie of his fellow workers. In the brief moments of rest between hauling and heaving, the men would trade stories of their old lives in the villages, would share dreams of the futures they hoped to return to once their stint of labor was done. They clung to each other in their shared hardship, united by the singular purpose of their toil. Itju's reverie was broken by a sudden shout from above. He looked up to see a massive block teetering at the edge of the tier above him, dislodged by a careless tug from an exhausted worker. Time seemed to slow as the block tumbled over the edge, hurtling directly towards the spot where Itju stood. Adrenaline surged through Itju's tired limbs, and he threw himself to the side, rolling away just as the heavy limestone crashed into the space he had occupied a heartbeat before. He lay stunned on the hot stone for a long moment, his heart racing with the nearness of his brush with death. Slowly, shakily, he picked himself up and looked around. The other workers stared at him with wide eyes, the same thought clear on all their dust-streaked faces. That could have been any one of them. The overseer stood impassively, already barking orders for the shattered block to be cleared, and work to resume. Itju took a long, steadying breath, trying to calm the trembling in his limbs. He knew he had been lucky, that the capricious gods had seen fit to spare him this time. But he also knew that luck was a fickle thing, as shifting as the desert sands. In a job like this, where peril lurked around every corner and death balanced on every block, one could only roll the dice so many times before they came up snake eyes. With a grim set to his jaw, Itju bent to pick up his tools once more. The pyramid waited, uncaring in its stone enormity, and he still had a weary way to go before he could rest. All around him, his fellow workers did the same, their momentary shocks subsumed once more into the grinding rhythm of the labor. Together, they bent their backs to the monumental task at hand, inching the mighty tomb towards completion, one treacherous block at a time. Years later, an older, wearier Itju would stand at the base of the finished pyramid, his eyes tracing the smooth slopes he had helped to shape. His body would be a map of scars and aches, a testament to the toil that had consumed the prime of his life. But as he gazed up at the gleaming monument, a complex mix of emotions would swell in his chest. pain and pride, resentment and reverence, all mingled into a bittersweet sense of awe at what he had helped to create. For in that moment, Itju would understand the true nature of his legacy, not as an individual, but as one small part of a greater whole. His name would be lost to history, his personal story swallowed by the sands of time. But his efforts, his sweat and blood and tears would live on in the eternal stone of the pyramid, a testament to the collective striving of a civilization that reached for the heavens. And so Itju would turn away from the mighty tomb, his heart heavy, but his spirit strangely lifted. He had played his role in the grand drama of history, had left his mark on the world in a way that few men could claim. And though the path had been hard and fraught with peril, he could not help but feel a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that his toil had mattered, that his pain had purchased a sliver of immortality. As he walked into the desert, Itju would let the wind and sand erase his footprints behind him, content in the knowledge that his true mark lay not in transient tracks, but in eternal stone. The pyramid would endure, and with it, so too would the memory of all those who had labored to raise it, a monument not just to the pharaohs, but to the indomitable spirit of the men who built their dreams into reality, one backbreaking block at a time. The fetid stench of the swamp clogged Shabaka's nostrils as he crept through the reeds, his eyes scanning the murky water for any sign of his quarry. The oppressive heat pressed down on him like a physical weight, and sweat trickled down his face to sting his eyes. But Shabaka ignored the discomfort, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Somewhere in this godforsaken morass lurked the crocodiles he had been sent to capture, great, scaly beasts that were prized by the nobles for their menageries and hunting parks. It was Shabaka's job to bring them in alive, a task that required equal parts skill, strength, and sheer nerve. He had been at this trade for years now, ever since he was old enough to hold a harpoon. His father had been a crocodile hunter before him, and his grandfather before that. It was a family legacy, a tradition passed down through generations of swamp dwellers who knew the ways of the river and the beasts that called it home. But it was not a legacy without cost. Shabaka bore the scars of his profession on his body and his soul. His arms were riddled with the marks of past battles, jagged bite marks, claw scratches, the puckered remains of a harpoon, wound from a hunt gone wrong. And those were just the visible scars. Inside, he carried the weight of the friends and family he had lost to the jaws and tails of the great beasts, the comrades who had waded into the swamp one day and never returned. A sudden movement in the water snapped Shabaka out of his dark musings. He froze, his muscles tensing as he watched a telltale ripple glide through the reeds. There, just beneath the surface, he could make out the silhouette of a massive crocodile, its scaly form distorted by the murky water. Slowly, carefully, Shabaka readied his harpoon. The weapon was a heavy thing, its barbed point wickedly sharp. It was attached to a long rope coiled at Shabaka's waist, ready to be played out when the moment of truth arrived. He crept forward, each step placed with infinite caution. The crocodile was close now, close enough that Shabaka could see the yellow gleam of its eyes just above the waterline. He knew he would only have one chance at this. If he missed his throw or failed to set the harpoon, the beast would be on him in a flash of teeth and thrashing tail. Shabaka took a slow, steadying breath, the fetid air thick in his lungs. Then, in one explosive motion, he lunged forward and threw the harpoon with all his might. The weapon struck true, burying itself deep in the crocodile's thick hide. Instantly, the beast erupted from the water, its massive jaws snapping shut with a sound like a slamming crypt door. It thrashed and rolled, trying to dislodge the harpoon, but Shabaka held fast to the rope, using all his strength to haul the raging monster towards the shore. It was a titanic struggle, man against beast in a primal battle of will and sinew. The crocodile was immensely strong, its muscles hardened by a lifetime of predatory dominance. It lashed its tail and clawed at the muddy bank, desperate to drag Shabaka back into the water where it could rend him limb from limb. But Shabaka was strong too, his body lean and hardened by years of this perilous work. He dug his feet into the muck and heaved with all his might, the rope biting into his calloused palms. Inch by hard-fought inch, he dragged the thrashing beast further onto the shore, until at last it lay spent and panting on the muddy ground. Quickly, moving with the efficiency of long practice, Shabaka bound the crocodile's massive jaws shut with heavy rope. He lashed its legs together, immobilizing it for the long trek back to the city. The beast's eyes rolled in its head, and it let out a low, rumbling hiss of impotent rage. Shabaka stepped back, breathing hard from the exertion. He was scratched and bruised, his skin slick with sweat and mud, but he was alive. Once again, he had emerged victorious from the jaws of death, had bent one of the river's mightiest predators to his will. But as he looked down at the bound and helpless crocodile, Shabaka felt a sudden pang of something almost like regret. This magnificent creature, this apex predator, was now reduced to a trophy, a living ornament for the amusement of the wealthy and powerful. In the grand order of the swamp, where life and death hung in a delicate balance, there was something that felt profoundly wrong about that. Shabaka shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was not his place to question the whims of the nobles who paid for his services. His job was to capture crocodiles, and that was what he would continue to do, no matter the cost to the beasts or to himself. It was his legacy, his inheritance, the only life he had ever known. With a grunt of effort, Shabaka heaved the bound crocodile onto his broad shoulders. The beast was immensely heavy, its scaly bulk bearing down on him like the weight of destiny itself. But Shabaka bore it stoically, his jaw set and his eyes hard as he began the long, slogging journey back to civilization. As he walked, the swamp closed in around him, the reeds seeming to whisper with the ghosts of all the hunters who had come before. In their rustle, Shabaka fancied he could hear the voices of his father, his grandfather, the whole long line of crocodile wranglers stretching back into the mists of time. They urged him on, even as they mourned the toll his trade would take. For Shabaka knew, with the grim certainty of a man who lived perpetually in death's shadow, that one day the swamp would claim him too. One day his luck would run out, his strength would fail, and the jaws of a crocodile would close around him for the final time. It was the fate of all who chose this life, the price of a legacy written in blood and scale. But until that day came, the sun beats down mercilessly on the rocky outcropping known as the Giza Plateau. It's around 2550 BC, and the Great Pyramid of Khufu, one of ancient Egypt's most ambitious construction projects, is nearing completion after over 2 decades of grueling labor. The deafening chip of copper chisels on limestone blocks mingles with the grunts and shouts of thousands of workers as they heave the heavy stones up the ramps encircling the emerging pyramid. Most are peasant farmers, conscripted into mandatory service during the months when their fields are flooded by the Nile. One of these men, a weathered laborer named Itju, pauses for a moment to catch his breath, sweat streaming down his dust-caked face. He rolls his muscular shoulders, wincing as he reaches for his water skin. Itju takes a long pull, relishing the relief of lukewarm water on his parched throat. As he stares up at the monumental structure rising before him, a stab of pride mingles with his exhaustion. Itju has been toiling on the pyramid for over 15 years now, since he was a teenager, watching it grow taller block by heavy block, year after back-breaking year. He's one of the lucky ones, Many of his fellow workers have been maimed or killed by falling stones, rock slides, and heat stroke over the years. Itju recalls his first days on the project as a gawky 15-year-old, struggling to keep up with the older, tougher men. The limestone blocks seemed impossibly huge and heavy to him then, and his hands would quickly become raw and blistered from grappling with the rough stone. But slowly, his scrawny frame filled out with wiry muscle, and his palms turned to leathery calluses. Now in his 30s, Itju moves with the easy strength and skill of a master pyramid builder, his body perfectly adapted to the rigors of the work. But that doesn't make the job any less punishing. He aches constantly from hauling heavy blocks, and his lungs burn from inhaling the omnipresent limestone dust. He has seen friends crushed by tumbling rocks or crippled by falls. Life in the workers' village is hard too. Itju and the other labourers are roused before dawn each morning by the bellows of foremen and the lash of whips on stragglers' backs. They gulp down a meagre breakfast of flatbread, onions, and weak beer before trudging out to the construction site for a day of brutal exertion under the savage Egyptian sun. The work continues without rest until dusk. Itju's crew is building the pyramid from the bottom up, dragging the limestone blocks up a spiral ramp that will eventually reach the planned height of the monument, an astounding 481 feet. Each block weighs around 2.5 tons and must be cut by hand and hauled up the ramp by teams of men with ropes and wooden rollers. Heaving together, Itju and his team drag a particularly massive block up the steep incline, sweat-slick hands straining on the ropes. Inch by hard-fought inch, they pull the stone up the ramp, legs shaking and lungs heaving from the effort. The physical strain is excruciating, despite Itju's long years of conditioning. Suddenly, one of the men slips, and the block jerks backwards as the team scrambles to brace themselves. Itju throws his entire weight against the stone to prevent it from sliding back down the ramp and crushing the crew. For a perilous moment, he feels his feet slipping in the gravel and his muscles screaming as he pushes against the block with every ounce of his strength. At last, the other men regain their footing and heave the stone forward, and the crisis is averted. They pause at the top of the ramp, gasping for breath, hearts pounding. A grizzled old crew chief claps Itju on the back, nodding in curt approval of his quick reflexes. Escaping death and severe injury is an almost daily occurrence in this line of work. As the day wears on, the desert wind kicks up, blasting the workers with flying grit that makes their eyes sting and tear. Itju pulls a rag over his mouth and nose and squints against the stinging sand and searing brightness. The heat is like a physical weight bearing down on them, sapping their energy and slowing their movements. By the time the sun finally sinks below the horizon and the foremen call a halt, Itju is running on sheer willpower, his body pushed to its absolute limits. He and the other exhausted labourers stagger back to the village, almost too tired to eat the evening meal of lentils, vegetables, and more coarse bread that awaits them. They fall onto sleeping mats in mud brick barracks, packed in shoulder to shoulder. Despite his bone-deep fatigue, the aches and pains of the day make it difficult for Itju to find a comfortable position on the thin mat. But eventually, the rhythm of his neighbour's snores lulls him into a restless sleep, his dreams full of the scrape of stone on stone. Tomorrow, he'll repeat the whole brutal cycle again. After 15 years of this punishing routine, Itju's body is as hard and weathered as the blocks he hauls. His skin is deeply tanned and leathery from constant sun exposure, his hands rough and scarred. But for all the calluses he has built up, Itju knows his joints and muscles are slowly being ground down by the work. His back and knees eroded by decades of compressed cartilage and strained sinews. Still, as he gazes up at the nearly finished pyramid, its peak now lost in the shimmering distance, Itju feels a complex mix of emotions. The bitter hardship of the building is tempered by an awe at the unprecedented scale of what he and his fellow Egyptians have achieved. This awe is sharpened by the bone-deep certainty that the pyramid will stand for centuries, maybe even millennia, after Itju and everyone he knows are dead. He wonders if the kings and scribes and priests who will admire the magnificent structure in the future will ever spare a thought for the thousands of calloused hands and straining backs that made it all possible. Will they imagine the individual lives and struggles of men like him? Or will they simply take the pyramid for granted as an eternal symbol of the glory of the great King Khufu? With a sigh, Itju pushes such thoughts away. The pyramid may be Khufu's immortality, but Itju's legacy is a humbler one. The calluses on his palms, the scars from old injuries, the permanent crick in his back. These are the marks left by a lifetime of hard labour, unremarked and unsung. The worker's role may be anonymous, but the fruits of their efforts will endure in stone for all time, a testament to their skill, grit, and sacrifice. It's not much comfort to an aging, aching body, but it's something. Itju squares his shoulders, feeling the familiar twinge of pain, and readies himself for another day of toil. The pyramid won't finish itself after all. As he falls into the rhythm of hauling blocks once again, Itju's mind empties of everything but the brute effort of the task. The pain in his muscles fades into the background, blotted out by the all-consuming labour. There is something almost meditative about the single-minded focus required, a purity of purpose. Itju loses himself in the repetitive physical exertion, his world narrowed down to the weight of the stone against his hands, the strain of the rope across his shoulders, the rasp of his breath. Time seems to contract and expand strangely, minutes stretching into hours and hours blurring into one long, continuous ache. In a way, his entire adult life has been like one endless day at the pyramid, the months and years of toil blending together into a haze of sweat and stone dust. He can scarcely remember a time before the construction consumed his waking hours, can hardly imagine what he'll do with himself when the project finally ends. Building the pyramid has shaped Itju as surely as he and his fellow labourers have shaped the great blocks that form it. The man he was before, the callow, soft-handed boy who balked at the idea of such back-breaking work, is long gone, chiselled away by hardship and time. In his place stands this taciturn, sinewy labourer, as much a part of the pyramid as the limestone itself. As the sun reaches its zenith, the heat becomes a shimmering force, distorting the air and making the blocks seem to dance before Itju's eyes. He shakes his head to clear it, wiping the sweat from his brow with hands that tremble slightly from fatigue. Grimly, he bent his shoulders to the work once more. There will be time enough for rest when the pyramid is finished, or when Itju himself is spent, whichever comes first. For now, there is only the brute labour, the simple purpose of stone and sinew. He loses himself in the rhythm of the work as the sun traces its arc overhead, the hours blurring together into one long strain of effort. By the time the light begins to fade and the last block of the day is hauled into place, Itju can scarcely feel his body anymore. His muscles have transcended mere aching and gone numb, moving as if of their own accord. His mind is a similar blank, too weary even for the evening's usual worries and idle musings. He shambles to the workers' camp with the rest of the crew, going through the motions of the meal and bedtime preparations in a daze. Sinking down onto his sleeping mat, Itju surrenders gratefully to the dark oblivion of a dreamless sleep. His last thought before unconsciousness claims him is that he will need every scrap of rest he can steal before the next day of merciless exertion begins anew with the rising of the sun. As Itju slips into the deep slumber of total exhaustion, we leave him to his hard-earned repose. The story of this pyramid builder may be lost to history, his name unrecorded in the annals of the great kings. But in a way, he and his fellow labourers have inscribed their own kind of immortality in the stones they shaped and stacked with such skill and struggle. Long after Itju and Khufu and the entire civilization of ancient Egypt have faded into dust, the magnificent monuments they raised will endure, stark and enigmatic against the desert sky. And though the hands that built them may be forgotten, the mute stones will carry within them always the memory of tens of thousands of Itjus, the anonymous individuals whose humble lives and labours made such wonders possible. The legacy of their efforts, if not their names, will stand for all time, as solid and unshakable as the pyramids themselves. As we've seen, life in ancient Egypt was far from easy for the common folk. While the pharaohs and nobility lived in opulent palaces and enjoyed the finest luxuries, the vast majority of Egyptians toiled in difficult, dirty, and often dangerous jobs. From the embalmer's assistants who prepared the dead for the afterlife, to the pyramid builders who hauled limestone blocks under the scorching sun, to the brave souls who captured crocodiles from the Nile, many Egyptians endured hard labor and hazardous conditions just to scrape by. One of the most challenging and dreaded jobs in ancient Egypt was that of the copper miner. Copper was a crucial resource for the Egyptians, used to make everything from tools and weapons to jewelry and statues. But extracting this valuable metal from the earth was no easy feat. Meet Ptahmos, a young man from a small village near the Nile Delta. With few other options to support his family, Ptahmos travelled far from home to the desolate Sinai Peninsula, where the Egyptians had established mining camps to exploit the region's mineral wealth. Here, he joined hundreds of other miners toiling in the dark, narrow tunnels snaking deep underground. Day after day, Ptahmos spent long hours chipping away at the rock walls by the dim light of oil lamps. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with dust that made it hard to breathe. The threat of cave-ins and noxious gases loomed constantly. Many miners developed debilitating lung diseases from inhaling the fine, sharp particles of rock. Ptahmos and his fellow miners used bronze chisels to laboriously follow veins of green and blue-hued malachite ore, the main source of copper. They hauled baskets of the mineral-rich rock out of the mine shafts to be crushed and smelted into ingots. It was back-breaking labor with few breaks under the watchful eyes of overseers. Weeks might pass before the miners were rotated back to the surface. Emerging from the subterranean darkness, Ptahmos would blink in the searing desert sunlight, his skin pale and his muscles aching. A short rest, a little beer and bread, and then it was back into the bowels of the earth to extract more of Egypt's mineral lifeblood. As grueling as Ptahmos' job was, in some ways he was fortunate. The turquoise and copper mines in the Sinai were prized possessions of the pharaohs. Some miners were permanent employees, even given their own small dwellings. Others were conscripted peasants or slaves who lived in more deplorable conditions, but all faced the same dangerous drudgery, chipping away at the earth day after day. The copper that miners like Ptahmos extracted at such high costs formed the basis of one of the ancient world's most important industries. Copper was alloyed with tin to make bronze, which the Egyptians used for a variety of purposes. Artisans cast it into sacred statues of gods and pharaohs. Scribes used bronze pens to record the deeds of kings. And perhaps most importantly, weaponsmiths forged copper and bronze into the swords, spearheads, and shields that helped expand and defend Egypt's borders. So the next time you admire the bronze sculptures and artifacts of ancient Egypt displayed reverently in museums, spare a thought for miners like Ptahmos. These unsung labourers, toiling in dark and dangerous conditions, made Egypt's golden age possible. The glistening metals that bedazzle us today came at a steep price for the hard-working hands that wrenched them from the earth all those centuries ago. Of course, mining was just one of many difficult and thankless jobs in ancient Egypt. Another profession that was absolutely essential but far from glamorous was that of the tax collector. Now, paying taxes is never fun, but in ancient Egypt it was a downright dangerous affair. Enter Senefer, a scribe with an unenviable new assignment. As a young man from a family of scribes, Senefer had spent years honing his skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic. His sharp mind and keen eye for numbers caught the attention of a high-ranking official, who plucked Senefer from the ranks of temple record keepers and gave him a new job, tax assessor. In ancient Egypt, taxes were paid not in coins, but in grain, livestock, and other agricultural produce. It was the tax collector's job to travel the length of the Nile, stopping at each town and village to assess how much each farmer owed based on the size of their fields and the bounty of their harvest. As you can imagine, this did not make Senefer a popular man. Senefer soon found himself facing all manner of excuses, evasions, and outright hostility as he went about his rounds. Farmers hid their grain stores, underreported their acreage, and feigned poverty to avoid paying what they owed. Some even resorted to bribes and threats to persuade Senefer to look the other way. But Senefer was a man of principle, and he wasn't about to risk his own neck by shortchanging the state. Equipped with land registers, aerial surveys, and a team of assistants, he meticulously calculated each farmer's tax burden, even physically measuring fields with knotted ropes to ensure accuracy. One particularly tense scene unfolded on the estate of a wealthy landowner named Jedefra. Known for his avarice and quick temper, Jedefra flatly refused to pay the assessed amount, insisting that his fields had yielded a poor harvest that year. Senefer, however, had done his homework and knew that Jedefra's claims didn't add up. In a dramatic confrontation, Senefer and his team marched onto Jedefra's property with a contingent of soldiers and began confiscating grain from his bulging storehouses. Jedefra railed and cursed, but he was no match for the authority of the state. In the end, he had no choice but to pay up, glowering as Senefer tallied his dues on a rolled papyrus scroll. Such showdowns were all in a day's work for Senefer, but that didn't make his job any easier. He spent long months away from his family, traveling up and down the Nile to ensure that the pharaoh's coffers were full. He braved the wrath of his countrymen and the scorn of the nobility, all to keep Egypt's economy running smoothly. It was a thankless task, but in some ways, tax collectors like Senefer were the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt. By ensuring a steady flow of resources into the state treasury, they funded the grand building projects, military campaigns, and social programs that made Egypt one of the most advanced civilizations of its time. The food collected as taxes fed the army, the laborers, and the bureaucrats who kept the gears of the state turning. So while no one likes paying taxes, spare a thought for the brave men like Senefer who made it their life's work. Shouldering the burdens of an often hostile populace, they played a vital role in maintaining order and prosperity in the land of the pharaohs. It may not have been a glamorous job, but it was an indispensable one. From the depths of the copper mines to the grain fields of the Nile Delta, ancient Egypt was a land of hardship and toil for many. But among all the difficult and unpleasant jobs that kept the kingdom running, perhaps none was quite so stomach-churning as that of the gong farmer. What, you may ask, is a gong farmer? The term may sound quaint, even whimsical, but the reality was anything but. In the days before modern sanitation, the gong farmer performed the unenviable task of removing waste from the latrines and cesspits of Egypt's cities. Meet Akencheres, a lean, wiry man with a weathered face and a perpetual scowl. Born into a family of gong farmers, Akencheres had little choice but to follow in his father's malodorous footsteps. From a young age, he and his brothers were initiated into the trade, learning how to use long-handled rakes and buckets to scoop the stinking muck out of the public toilets and private cesspools of Memphis. It was a grim and gag-inducing business. In the stifling heat of the Egyptian summer, the stench was unimaginable. Akencheres and his crew worked mostly at night, when the streets were empty and the air was slightly less foul. They slogged through narrow, sewage-clogged alleyways, their sandals squelching in the muck, their nostrils assaulted by the reek of human waste. Using long-handled scoops, the Gong farmers transferred the waste into large ceramic jars, which were then loaded onto donkey carts. The carts creaked and groaned under the weight of their noxious cargo as the Gong farmers led them out of the city. A reeking caravan bound for the desiccated fields beyond the city walls. There, the waste would be dumped into large pits and left to dry in the baking sun. Once the moisture had evaporated, the remaining solids would be sold to farmers as fertilizer. It was a process as old as agriculture itself, but that didn't make it any less revolting. For Akancheres and his fellow Gong farmers, this was a life sentence. Covered in filth, reeking of excrement, they were shunned by polite society. No one wanted to associate with the men who waded through the city's waste. Even after scrubbing themselves raw, the stench seemed to linger, a noxious miasma that marked them as untouchable. But as much as they were reviled, the Gong farmers served a vital function. In a time before sewer systems and waste treatment plants, they were the unsung heroes who kept Egyptian cities from drowning in their own filth. Without their back-breaking, stomach-turning labour, the streets would have been impassable, the air unbreathable. So spare a thought for Akancheres and his ilk, the forgotten labourers who toiled in the muck and the mire to keep ancient Egypt clean. It was a dirty job, a thankless job, but someone had to do it. And in the end, when Akancheres crawled into his humble bed at night, his muscles aching and his nose numb to the stench, perhaps he could take some small comfort in knowing that his work, however humble, helped keep the great wheel of Egyptian civilization turning. From the miners chipping away at copper veins, to the tax collectors braving the wrath of farmers, to the Gong farmers wading through waste, the common laborers of Egypt endured unimaginable hardships. Their stories may not be as well known as those of the great pharaohs and queens, but their contributions were no less vital. Without the back-breaking labor of farmers, craftsmen, builders, and cleaners, the mighty monuments and grand cities of Egypt would never have been possible. It was their sweat and toil that raised the pyramids, filled the granaries, and kept the kingdom running smoothly. As we've seen through the eyes of people like Ahmose, the embalmer's apprentice, Itju, the pyramid builder, and Tammuz, the copper miner, life for the average Egyptian was often one of unrelenting hardship. They faced dangers and discomforts that would be unthinkable to most of us today. From the threat of cave-ins and crocodile attacks, to the daily grind of hauling stone and harvesting crops under the scorching sun. Yet through it all, these ordinary Egyptians displayed an extraordinary resilience and determination. They took pride in their work, however humble, knowing that they played a part in maintaining the glory of Egypt. From the artists who decorated tombs to the sailors who braved the Nile's currents, each laborer contributed in their own way to the greatness of the kingdom. So as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back through the centuries to the banks of the Nile. Picture the teeming cities and the bustling ports, the golden fields of grain and the towering monuments reaching towards the sky. But don't forget the countless hands that built them, the farmers and the craftsmen, the miners and the Gong farmers, toiling in the heat and the dust to make Egypt's wonders possible. Their names may be lost to history, but their legacy endures in every brick and block, every shining jewel and shimmering mural. They were the beating heart of ancient Egypt, the unsung heroes who kept the great kingdom alive. And though their lives were often hard and their ends humble, they played a part in building a civilization that would be remembered for all time. So, as you slip into slumber, spare a thought for these forgotten laborers and the grit and resilience they embodied. May their stories remind us that greatness is not just the province of kings and conquerors, but of the everyday people who toil and strive to make their world a better place. And may we, like the ancient Egyptians, find the strength to endure life's hardships with grace and determination, knowing that our efforts, however small, contribute to a greater whole. Good night, and sweet dreams of the long-ago laborers who built wonders under the Egyptian sun. The life of a pyramid builder was one of toil and grit under the searing Egyptian sun. For decades on end, teams of laborers would haul immense blocks of limestone up ramps, fitting them together with expert precision to slowly erect these monumental tombs for the pharaohs. One such builder was a man named Itju. Itju was born into a humble family in the village of Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile. As a young man, he dreamed of becoming a respected scribe, learning to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script. But his family's meager means could not afford the years of education required. Instead, like his father and uncles before him, Itju was conscripted into service as a laborer on the pharaoh's latest ambitious building project, a towering pyramid that would serve as the monarch's eternal resting place. Day after day, from dawn till dusk, Itju and his fellow workers toiled away in the quarries and on the construction site. Chisels rang out as limestone blocks were cut from the earth. Teams of men strained with ropes and sleds to haul the heavy stones to the build site. Barked orders from overseers cut through the clamour as they directed the placements of each block according to the architect's meticulous blueprint. The work was backbreaking, the hours long, and the rations meagre. Itju grew lean and tough as the months and years rolled by, his skin weathered and bronzed by ceaseless exposure to the beating sun. Some days, the scorching heat was enough to fell men where they stood, but still, the work could not stop. Pharaoh's tomb must be made ready for that unavoidable day his soul would depart for the afterlife. Itju witnessed many of his compatriots succumb to exhaustion, injury, and disease over the long years of the pyramid's construction. A tumble from the steep inclines could maim a man in a blink. Limbs were sometimes crushed under massive stones. Lungs filled with the fine limestone dust kicked up by their labours. It was a hard, unforgiving existence, a life of endless toil to ensure a splendid eternal one for their god-king. In rare moments of rest, Itju would stand at the pyramid's base, craning his neck to gaze up at the gleaming, ever-growing edifice. He marvelled at what he and his fellow Egyptians were accomplishing together, a monument that would endure for ages untold, long after all their tired bones had turned to dust. It gave him a small sense of pride and purpose, even as his body ached and his spirits sometimes wavered. Finally, after nearly 3 decades, the pyramid was complete. Itju, now grey of hair and stiff of joint, stood with the throngs of his fellow workers as the pharaoh's mummy was borne into the heart of the immense structure for its eternal rest. As the last stone was heaved into place to seal the tomb, a cheer rose up from the labourers, a sound of triumph, relief, and bittersweet pride. In that moment, Itju felt a swell of satisfaction, even as old aches and pains nagged at him. He may not have achieved his dream of becoming a learned scribe, but he and his comrades had etched their legacy in stone. The pyramid would stand as an eternal testament to the blood, sweat, and sheer tenacity of the people who built it. And Itju had been a part of that, an essential brick in the grand monument of their civilization. As the crowds began to disperse back to their villages, Itju took one last long look at the magnificent tomb, squinting against the sun's glare off its polished white faces. With a quiet sigh, he turned and began the long walk back to his family home. It was time to rest his weary body and reflect on a hard life's work well done. The pharaoh would sleep eternally, but Itju and his fellow builders would live on in the marvel they had wrought upon the Egyptian sands. While the pyramid builders were essential in constructing the pharaoh's lavish afterlife accommodations, there was another profession that was just as vital in preparing the monarchs for their eternal journey, the embalmers. And no one had a more stomach-churning role in that morbid business than the embalmer's assistants. Young Amos, just 14 years old, fidgeted nervously as he stood in the corner of the embalming workshop. A cramped, dim room that reeked of natron salt, frankincense, and the sickly sweet odor of decay. Wide-eyed, he watched as his father, the chief embalmer, made the first cut into the corpse laid out on the table. This was Amos's first day as his father's apprentice, and he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for the grisly duties to come. With deft, practiced strokes, Amos's father worked to remove the body's organs one by one for preservation in canopic jars. Amos felt his gorge rise as he saw the viscera lifted out, but he swallowed hard, determined not to shame himself. This was the profession of his family, after all. They held the responsibility of ensuring the pharaoh's body was properly prepared for the afterlife. It was an honor, even if a queasy one. As the chief embalmer progressed with his delicate work, he beckoned Ahmose over. "Here, son," he said, handing the youth a small, sharp knife. "It's time you learned to help. Start unpacking the body cavities with natron. Go on now." Amos took the knife in a shaking hand, trying to still his nerves. Gingerly, he began to scoop out handfuls of the potent salts, layering them into the empty abdominal cavity. The pungent smell filled his nostrils, but he persisted, focusing on the task with all the determination his young mind could muster. Over the coming weeks and months, Amos learned the embalmer's craft under his father's guiding hand. He graduated from packing cavities to removing the delicate paper-thin membranes around the lungs and liver, his hands growing steadier and surer with each passing corpse. Yet as his skills grew, so too did his distaste for the macabre work. Amos never could quite shake the instinctive revulsion he felt at handling the bodies, even as it became routine. The once overwhelming smells of decay and embalming spices eventually faded into the background for him, but the emotional weight of his grim duties lingered. There were nights he would startle awake in a cold sweat, the ghostly faces of the bodies he'd prepared seeming to hover in the darkness of his room. But he would always shake it off and present himself dutifully at the workshop each morning, knowing his role was a necessary one. The pharaoh and his court must reach the afterlife intact to take their rightful place among the gods, no matter how unsettling the process was for a young assistant like Ahmose. As the years went by and Amos grew from a gangly youth into a capable young man, he took on more and more responsibility in the embalming room. His father looked on with quiet pride as Amos mastered even the finest, most nerve-wracking tasks, like extracting the brain through the nose with a long hooked instrument. While Amos never grew to enjoy his work, he did gain a deep respect for its importance and an appreciation for the delicate artistry of a well-mummified body. When at last, his father deemed him ready to take over as chief embalmer and passed on his tools, Amos accepted the role with solemn duty, even as a part of him secretly wished for a less morbid path. But such was the lot of an embalmer in ancient Egypt. Their stomachs might churn, and their dreams might twitch with visions of the grim rites they performed. But they were a cog as essential as any scribe or architect in the grand machine of their civilization's obsession with the afterlife. And Amos would fulfill his role with all the skill and dedication that was his inheritance, distasteful as it often was. Of course, not all the distasteful jobs in ancient Egypt involved tending to human remains. Some were more on the wild side, like the crocodile wranglers who braved the Nile's depths to capture the ferocious beasts for the royals' menageries and hunting parks. Shabaka crept along the marshy banks of the great river, his keen eyes scanning the murky waters for any sign of his scaly quarry. The seasoned hunter knew well the habits of the Nile crocodiles, their favorite basking spots, their feeding grounds, the hidden coves where they would haul out to rest in the sun. He'd been hunting the beasts since he was a small boy, learning the trade from his uncles in their village far to the south. Now Shabaka was known far and wide as one of the best croc catchers in the land, hired by temples and nobles alike to supply the fearsome reptiles for their collections. It was a hard life, spending long weeks away from home stalking through the swamps and riverbanks. Shabaka's skin was weathered and scarred from countless close calls with snapping jaws and lashing tails. But the thrill of the hunt sang in his blood, and he relished the challenge each wily croc presented. Suddenly, a telltale ripple caught Shabaka's eye, the only warning before a massive crocodile burst from the shallows in a spray of water and gnashing teeth. Shabaka leaped back with a shout, his harpoon at the ready. The beast was a big one, nearly as long as a man is tall, its scales glinting like bronze in the sun. With a roar, Shabaka lunged forward, driving his harpoon at the thrashing animal. The point found its mark in the croc's thick hide, drawing a bellow of rage from the creature. Shabaka hung on grimly as the crocodile writhed and rolled, trying to dislodge the harpoon or drag its assailant into the churning water. It was a deadly dance Shabaka knew well. One false step, one moment of inattention, and he could easily end up as just another of the river's many victims, forever lost in the croc's bone-crushing jaws. But Shabaka was strong and quick and canny. Slowly, inch by hard-fought inch, he hauled the weakening beast up onto the muddy bank, its fight gradually succumbing to exhaustion. With a final, defiant hiss, the crocodile went limp, its strength spent. Panting and streaked with mud, Shabaka let out a triumphant whoop. He'd bagged another prize for the Royal Hunting Park, a beast that would thrill the nobles as they played at stalking dangerous game within the safety of the enclosure walls. Shabaka bound the croc's fearsome jaws shut with sturdy ropes and hoisted it up onto a sled for the long haul back to the city. The hunter rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache of scratches and bruises, both new and old. His prize might fetch a good price from the royal handlers, but Shabaka took little joy in the money. For him, the reward was in the hunt itself, the matching of wits and strength against one of the river's most feared predators. As he began the slog homeward through the papyrus marshes, tugging his scaly captive behind, Shabaka's thoughts were already turning to the next hunt, the next heart-pounding tussle with death in the waters of the mighty Nile. It was a hard life, fraught with peril, but for a born crocodile wrangler like Shabaka, there was no other he'd rather lead. The sting of croc scratches and the reek of the beasts were as familiar to him as the calluses on his hands and the scars on his skin. Badges of honor for a man who'd made a living dancing with some of Egypt's most fearsome creatures. But while Shabaka reveled in his rough outdoor existence, there were some in Egypt for whom the greatest dangers lay not in untamed wilderness, but deep beneath the earth. For the copper miners who delved into the depths of the Sinai desert, each day brought a claustrophobic battle against darkness, dust, and despair. Ptahmos wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting in the flickering light of the oil lamp as he chipped relentlessly at the unforgiving rock. The coppery gleam of malachite winked back at him from the depths of the stone, the precious ore that was the lifeblood of Egypt's bronze industry and the reason for his toil here in the bowels of the earth. Day after day, Ptahmos and his fellow miners labored in the close, suffocating confines of the mine shafts. The tunnels stretched out in all directions, a vast stifling labyrinth where the sun never reached. The air was thick with dust that coated the miners' lungs and left them coughing and spitting up black gobs, even as they hammered and chiseled ever deeper into the unyielding rock. It was grueling, punishing work. The men were forever stooped in the low tunnels, their muscles screaming from the endless exertion of swinging picks and hauling baskets of ore. The heat was oppressive, the darkness disorienting. There was little rest and less comfort to be found in the grim mining camps that clustered around each shaft entrance. But for Ptahmos, the hardest part was the isolation, the weeks and months spent cut off from the world above. He missed the warm breezes off the Nile, the sweet scent of lotus blossoms, the soft embrace of his wife. Down here, there was only the bitter tang of copper, the incessant tap of tools on stone, the low murmur of exhausted men in the dark. Sometimes, in the depths of the night when sleep wouldn't come, Tarmos's mind would turn to the many dangers that lurked in the shadows of the mines. He'd seen men crushed by sudden roof collapses, their bodies pulverized under tons of rubble. He choked and wheezed through pockets of noxious gases that left miners reeling and senseless. And always, there was the spectre of the lung diseases that claimed so many men, leaving them wasted and gasping, drowning in their own breath. But what choice did he have? This was the lot that life had drawn for Potamos. He had a family to feed, a duty to his village and his kingdom. And so each morning, he would rise with the first light and descend once more into the underworld of the copper mines, his pick in hand and a prayer to Ptah, the god of craftsmen, on his lips. The days blurred into an endless procession of dust and darkness, broken only by the occasional discovery of a particularly rich vein of gleaming malachite that would set the miners' hearts racing with weary triumph. Inch by inch, the tunnels drove deeper into the unyielding earth, following the precious copper that was the lifeblood of Bronze Age Egypt. And inch by inch, Tarmos could feel the mine etching itself into his very being. His hands were permanently darkened with the metallic taint, his lungs heavy with the weight of the stone dust. His mind wandered the twists and turns of the shafts, even in his dreams, forever seeking the elusive glint of malachite in the shadows. But still, he endured. For his family, for his kingdom, for the stubborn pride of a man determined to wrest a living from the unforgiving earth. And on the rare occasions when he emerged from the mines, blinking against the searing brightness of the desert sun, Tarmos would pause and lift his face to the vast expanse of blue above. In those moments, he would drink in the fresh, clear air like a man dying of thirst, feeling it scouring the dust from his lungs and the weariness from his soul. He would remember that there was a world beyond the suffocating confines of the mines, a world of light and life and love. And though he knew he would soon descend once more into the depths, back to the eternal struggle in the darkness, Potamos savoured those brief interludes of peace under the open sky. They were a reminder of what made all the toil worthwhile, the simple joys of home and family that were the true gold in a miner's hardscrabble life. So Tarmos would shoulder his pick and turn back to the yawning mouth of the mine shaft, ready to begin another long shift in the battle for copper in the unforgiving depths. It was a hard lot, but it was his, and he would see it through with all the grit and tenacity that was the birthright of an Egyptian miner, born to wrest the earth's treasures from its stony embrace. But not all the hardships of life in ancient Egypt were physical. For some, like the much maligned tax collectors, the chief struggles were those of the spirit, of doing a thankless duty in the face of scorn and resentment. Senefer sighed as he made his way down the dusty village path, his scribe's case clutched tight to his chest. The area farmers eyed him warily over the walls of their neat plots, suspicion and distaste written plain on their sun-weathered faces. They knew well the purpose of his visit, and they had little love for the kingdom's tax assessors. It was an unpleasant but necessary duty. As we've seen, life for the average person in ancient Egypt was no walk in the palace gardens. For every pampered prince or perfumed priestess, 100 humble souls toiled from dawn to dusk just to scrape by. Take Kamet, for instance. Kamet was a farmer, like his father and his father's father before him. He lived in a small mud brick house on the outskirts of Memphis with his wife and 3 little ones. Every morning, he rose with the sun to tend his tiny plot of land by the Nile. Kamet thanked the gods for the river's life-giving floods that left behind rich black silt, perfect for growing wheat, barley, and vegetables. But farming in ancient Egypt was never easy, even with the Nile's help. Kamet spent back-breaking hours ploughing, planting, weeding under the scorching sun. His hands grew calloused from gripping wooden tools, and his skin weathered to a leathery brown. There were always repairs to be made to the mud dikes and ditches that managed the flow of precious water to his crops. And the work didn't end at harvest time. Kamet had to defend his share of the grain from the tax collector, haggle with merchants at the market, and scrimp to afford new tools or a goat to supplement his meagre income. In the off-season, he hired himself out to nobles' estates or construction projects to make ends meet. It was a hard life, but an honest one. Kamet took pride in coaxing food from the earth to feed his family and community. In the evenings, he'd sit outside his hut, sipping barley beer and watching his children play in the fading light. These simple moments made it all worthwhile. Kamet's wife Nebet had her hands just as full. She was up before her husband to grind grain into flour for the day's bread. Loaves had to be shaped and baked in the courtyard oven, a hot and smoky affair. Then it was on to hauling water, cooking, cleaning, and mending clothes. Nebet also kept a few ducks and a vegetable garden behind their house. She pickled the excess in clay jars to store for the dry season. Any spare eggs or produce could be bartered with neighbours for oil, spices, or linen cloth. With 3 hungry kids, there were always 1,000 tasks to juggle. Though Nebet dreamed of luxuries like fine dishes and perfumes, she didn't envy the wealthy women who had servants to do everything for them. She took satisfaction in keeping a tidy household and preparing filling meals, however plain. Nebet was the industrious heart of her family. On festival days, Kamet and Nebet would dress the children in their best kilts and bring offerings to the local temple. They thanked the deities for the harvest and the Nile's abundance. The couple stood proudly as their eldest son took his place in the procession of priests. They had scrimped for years to send him to temple school for a scribe's education, dreaming he might have an easier life as an official or priest. But for now, it was back to the fields for Kamet and back to the hearth for Nebet. Season after season, they worked their fingers to the bone to wrest a living from the land. Multiply their story by 1,000, and you have the warp and weft of Egyptian society. Farmers like Kamet were the bedrock upon which the kingdom was built. They paid the taxes and provided the food surplus that allowed artisans, scribes, and priests to pursue their specialized crafts. They manned the pharaoh's armies and raised the next generation. The sacred Nile may have been the lifeblood of ancient Egypt, but it was everyday Egyptians who kept the heart of the civilization beating. Speaking of the heart, that precious organ was one of the few that embalmers like young Amos didn't remove when preparing a body for the afterlife. The heart was weighed against the feather of truth to see if the deceased had led a righteous life. But the brain, Amos had to pull that out through the nose with iron hooks as part of the mummification process. No one envied Amos and his fellow embalmers' grisly work. For 70 days, they labored over a single body, drying it out with natron salt, anointing it with resins, and wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen. The workshop constantly reeked of spices and decay. Accidentally nicking the wrong organ could unleash a noisome flood Amos would never forget. But as stomach-turning as his apprenticeship could be, Amos recognized it was important work. Mummification was a sacred art that ensured the deceased could enjoy eternal life. Amos took seriously his role in guiding souls to the field of reeds. In time, he learned to see past the gore and focus on the ritual's spiritual significance. Amos's own father, Pasenhor, was a master embalmer who had prepared the bodies of nobles and even a lesser prince. He taught Amosa that embalmers must approach their work with reverence and precision, for the gods would hold them accountable for any mistakes. Under Pasenhor's strict tutelage, Amos gradually progressed from mixing tubs of natron to making the first cut in a body's left flank. Not everyone had the constitution for such a macabre career. Pasenhor's previous apprentice had fainted at the sight of a freshly extracted liver and run out of the workshop, never to return. But Amose persevered, driven by a fascination with the secrets of life and death. He knew that in preserving others for the afterlife, he was securing his own ticket to immortality. Still, there were moments when the weight of his duties felt as heavy as a canopic jar. Like the time Amose had to mummify the tiny body of a nobleman's infant daughter. With tears in his eyes, he placed her heart-shaped amulet over the empty cavity in her chest, where her own heart had been. Ahmose said an extra prayer that Osiris would welcome this innocent soul with open arms. Ahmose may have spent his days elbow-deep in death, but he emerged from the embalming workshop with a profound appreciation for life. He cherished every moment with his wife and young son, knowing how fragile their time together was. And when he looked to the horizon and saw the peaks of the Great Pyramid silhouetted against the sky, Ahmose felt a rush of awe and gratitude. Those monuments were more than just massive tombstones. They were testaments to the Egyptian belief in an eternal hereafter. They had been built to stand for all time, just like the mummies Ahmose so carefully prepared. In their own ways, the pyramid builders and the embalmers were both ensuring that a little piece of their civilization would endure forever. But what was it like for the men who actually raised those limestone mountains, block by dusty block? Ichu knew all too well. He had been part of the workforce that constructed the Great Pyramid of Giza, the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu. For 20 years, Ichu had labored on that monumental project, from the first foundation stones to the last casing block. It was hard to fathom the scale of the undertaking. The Great Pyramid was the tallest structure on Earth, rising over 480 feet into the sky. Its base covered 13 acres, and each side was longer than 2 football fields. Inside were miles of shafts and chambers, all precisely aligned with the stars. The whole thing was sheathed in polished white limestone that gleamed like a second sun. To build such a wonder required an army of workers, stonecutters, haulers, masons, carpenters, engineers, and more. At the peak of construction, over 10,000 men labored on the Giza Plateau, toiling in 3-month shifts. They came from all over Egypt, leaving behind families and fields to serve their god-king's great vision. Ichu had been a farmer like Kamet before he was conscripted for pyramid duty. He still remembered the day the king's men came to his village, rounding up every able-bodied man and boy. Ichu had barely had time to kiss his wife goodbye before he was marched off with the others, a hoe still in his hand. At first, Ichu had been in awe of the great work. He marveled at the architect's blueprints, the precision of the surveyor's measurements, the skill of the masons shaping each block to perfection. But the novelty soon wore off as the brutal reality set in. Ichu's job was to help haul the stones up the ramps that spiraled around the pyramid as it rose. His team was assigned to transport granite blocks from the quarries at Aswan, hundreds of miles up the Nile. Each block weighed over 2 tons, as much as a pair of hippos. It took dozens of men straining on ropes to drag a single stone on a wooden sled. Under the scorching sun, they heaved and hauled for hours, muscles screaming and lungs burning. The limestone dust was so thick it coated Ichu's throat and stung his eyes. His hands bled from gripping the ropes, his feet blistered in his simple sandals, and always the relentless pounding of copper chisels and wooden rollers, and the shouts of overseers urging them on. There were accidents, of course, men crushed by falling blocks or tumbling off ramps, sleds that careened out of control, mowing down everything in their path. Ichu once saw a man step on a scorpion and die writhing in agony within minutes. Another time, the frayed rope on his own team's sled snapped, sending the granite block skidding back down the ramp. Ichu barely managed to leap out of its way as it smashed through supports and sent limestone flying like shrapnel. But as hard as the work was, the pyramid builders weren't slaves. They were paid laborers, receiving rations of bread and beer for their efforts. The king even provided on-site medical care for injuries, and there was undeniable pride in being part of something so grand and eternal. Itju bonded with his fellow haulers over shared hardships and small triumphs, like successfully maneuvering a massive block into place. In the evenings, they gathered around fire pits to trade jokes and stories from their home villages. On days off, they played board games and held wrestling matches. Some even earned extra beer rations by volunteering for the most dangerous jobs. As the years passed and the pyramid rose higher and higher, Itju marveled at what they were creating. Each tier was a testament to their blood, sweat, and dedication. Itju imagined the pharaoh's spirit ascending those stairways to the heavens and felt a fierce pride in his role in building that path to eternity. Finally, after 2 decades of toil, the Great Pyramid was finished. As the last gleaming casing stone was levered into place, a mighty cheer went up from the workforce. They had done it, raised the tallest, most perfect tomb the world had ever seen. Itju hugged his fellow haulers, tears streaking through the dust on his weathered face. There would be celebrations and feasts, but Itju felt a tinge of melancholy too. The great work that had consumed half his life was done. He would return to his village, to his family and fields. But part of him would always remain here at Giza. Itju knew that his own tomb would be a simple shaft in the sand, his body unpreserved. But in helping build Khufu's pyramid, he had achieved a small slice of immortality too. As Itju looked up at the majestic monument that had been his life's work, he imagined future generations marveling at it, just as he had marveled at the ancient wonders his own ancestors had built. Itju may have been just one humble laborer among thousands, but he and his comrades had raised a mountain that would endure for all time. With a final prayer of thanks and farewell, Itju turned his face toward home. While Itju and his fellow pyramid builders were hauling stone in the desert, other Egyptians were wrestling with a very different kind of beast. The Nile crocodile was one of the most feared predators in ancient Egypt, a scaly menace that could grow up to 20 feet long. These armored reptiles were known to snatch livestock, pets, and even children who strayed too close to the water's edge. But the Egyptians also revered crocodiles as sacred animals, associated with the god Sobek. Sobek was depicted as a man with a crocodile head and was worshipped as a protector and source of fertility. Live crocodiles were kept in temple pools and adorned with gold and jewels. When they died, they were mummified with as much care as any human. That put professional crocodile wranglers like Shabaka in high demand. Shabaka came from a long line of reptile wranglers who knew the Nile's every eddy and sandbar. From an early age, he had learned to read the river, where crocs basked, nested, and hunted. Shabaka could spot a croc's nostrils or eyes peeking above the surface from 100 paces. Most days, Shabaka patrolled the riverbanks, watching over villagers as they collected water or washed clothes. He carried a long bronze-tipped spear and wore a thick leather tunic in case he needed to fend off an aggressive croc. Shabaka took pride in keeping his people safe, even if they regarded him with a mix of fear and awe. But Shabaka's real job was capturing live crocodiles for the temples of Sobek. It was incredibly dangerous work, but Shabaka had a knack for it. He would bait a large hook with a plump fish or a duck and wait patiently for hours until he felt a tug on the line. Then the real struggle began. Shabaka would let the crocodile tire itself out before hauling it in, careful to avoid its thrashing tail and snapping jaws. He'd use his spear to pin down its head while his assistants bound its mouth with rope. The croc would be loaded onto a skiff to transport it back to the temple, where priests would perform purification rites before installing it in the sacred pool. One of Shabaka's most harrowing catches was a monstrous 18-foot male croc, a wily old bull that had eluded capture for years. This croc was notorious for capsizing fishing boats and had even attacked a priest at a riverside shrine. The high priest of Sobek charged Shabaka with bringing in the beast to face divine judgment. Shabaka tracked the giant croc for weeks, studying its habits and movements. He finally laid his trap at a secluded bend where the croc liked to bask, baiting it with an entire goat carcass. Sure enough, the bait was taken, and Shabaka found himself in the fight of his life. The huge croc nearly ripped Shabaka's arm off when he first hauled it in. It took 6 strong men to subdue the thrashing, snapping monster long enough to bind it with ropes and chains. One of Shabaka's assistants lost a finger to the croc's vice-like jaws. But finally, the exhausted men managed to load their prize catch onto a barge for the journey to the temple. When they arrived, the high priest declared that the gods had delivered the beast into their hands for judgment. In a solemn ceremony, the croc's fate was put to a sacred oracle. If the oracle determined the croc was guilty of crimes against the gods and the people, it would be ritually executed and mummified. If found innocent, it would be adorned and worshipped as a divine incarnation of Sobek. Shabaka held his breath as the priest cast the oracle bones and interpreted their cryptic patterns. To his relief, the croc was declared a sacred manifestation of the crocodile god. Its aggression toward humans merely a sign of its divine power. Shabaka nearly collapsed in exhaustion and gratitude. From that day on, the massive croc lived a life of luxury in the temple pool, bedecked in gold and lapis lazuli, fed choice cuts of meat by doting priests. Shabaka was hailed as a hero and lavished with rewards for his daring feat. But he never forgot the scars he bore from that epic battle, or the fact that his livelihood depended on the whims of both reptiles and gods. Despite the danger and uncertainty, Shabaka couldn't imagine doing anything else. He was a master of his craft, a friend to the fearsome river dragons. When he retired after a long career, Shabaka's own mummified body was entombed with great honor in a crocodile necropolis. He had earned his place among the scaled guardians of the Nile. Of course, not all of Egypt's beasts were as revered as the crocodile. Take the humble donkey, the hard-working pack animal that was the backbone of Egyptian transport. Donkeys carried everything from grain sacks to building stones, from beer jugs to firewood bundles. They plodded along next to farmers in fields, merchants on roads, and miners in desert camps. One such miner was Tammuz, who spent his days chipping malachite ore from the depths of a Sinai copper mine. Tammuz was one of hundreds of miners who toiled in the gloom, their way lit only by smoky oil lamps. The tunnels were so narrow the men had to crawl on their bellies, so hot. As we've seen, life in ancient Egypt was far from easy for the average person. While the pharaohs and nobility enjoyed lavish lifestyles, the vast majority of Egyptians toiled day in and day out at grueling, thankless jobs. From embalming the dead to building colossal monuments, these workers endured unimaginable hardships to keep the kingdom running smoothly. But perhaps no profession was quite as stomach-churning as that of the Nile crocodile wrangler. The ancient Egyptians revered crocodiles as sacred creatures, associating them with the fearsome god Sobek. Temples kept live crocodiles in pools as divine avatars, while kings and wealthy nobles stocked their hunting grounds with the scaly beasts. But capturing these ferocious reptiles from the wild was no easy feat. Enter Shabaka, a grizzled crocodile hunter from a small village along the Nile. Lean and weather-beaten from a life spent in the marshes, Shabaka learned the ways of crocodiles from his father and grandfather before him. He knew their favorite basking spots, their feeding habits, and their aggressive territoriality. Armed with this knowledge and an array of ropes, nets, and harpoons, Shabaka made a living snaring crocs for the royal menageries and ritual pools. We can picture Shabaka now, crouched low in his flimsy reed boat, gliding silently through a lush papyrus swamp. His keen eyes scan the shoreline for any sign of his quarry. Then he spots it, a massive bull crocodile, sunning itself on a muddy bank. At over 15 feet long and weighing nearly a ton, this beast could easily snap Shabaka in half with a single bite. But our intrepid hunter isn't deterred. Carefully, oh so carefully, Shabaka poles his boat closer, taking great pains not to alert the crocodile. With bated breath, he readies his harpoon, takes aim, and lets the spear fly. It's a direct hit, but the croc is only wounded, not subdued. Thrashing and roaring, the enraged animal whips around to attack its assailant. In a flash, Shabaka drops his harpoon and lunges for his nets. He must immobilize the crocodile before it can drag him into a death roll. Man and beast grapple in a chaotic tangle of limbs, rope, and snapping jaws. The croc's lashing tail nearly capsizes Shabaka's boat. Its scaly hide is slick with blood and muck, making it almost impossible to restrain. But Shabaka has done this dance many times before. With a burst of desperate strength, he wrestles the exhausted crocodile into submission, cinching his ropes around its mighty jaws. The fight is over, but the real work has just begun. Now Shabaka must transport this hulking, irate creature back to civilization intact. No small feat in the days before refrigerated trucks and tranquilizer darts. Bruised, cut, and utterly spent, Shabaka secures his prize to the side of the boat and begins the long slog back up the Nile. It's a journey he's made countless times, but the peril is never far from his mind. A single slip, a moment's inattention, and he could lose a limb or worse to his very unhappy passenger. Hours later, Shabaka drags himself onto the docks of Crocodilopolis, the ritual center of Sobek worship. His clothes are in tatters, his skin caked with mud and blood, both his own and the crocodile's. Waiting priests quickly whisk his bellowing cargo away to the temple pens, where it will live out its days in pampered captivity. For Shabaka, it's the end of another harrowing mission. But there will always be more crocs to catch, more offerings to procure for the fickle reptile god. As the weary hunter trudges back to his humble hut, we have to marvel at the courage and skill of men like Shabaka. In a society that revered dangerous beasts as deities, the crocodile wrangler played a small but crucial role. His was a life of constant peril, stalking some of nature's most formidable predators in their own domain. Every day was a gamble, every hunt a dance with death. And yet, without the knowledge and bravery of Shabaka and his fellow croc catchers, the sacred menageries and hunting parks of ancient Egypt would have stood empty. So the next time you see a mummy portrait or a stylized crocodile statue in a museum, spare a thought for the unsung heroes who made it all possible. The embalmers elbow deep in entrails, the miners choking on dust deep underground, and yes, the crocodile wranglers risking life and limb to capture the river's most fearsome denizens. Their backbreaking labor and quiet courage built and maintained the mighty civilization we still marvel at today. Speaking of another overlooked profession in ancient Egypt, let's turn our attention to the much maligned tax collector. Now, nobody likes paying taxes, no matter what era they live in. But in the days of the pharaohs, tax collectors were especially despised figures. After all, it was their job to show up at your doorstep every year and demand a portion of your hard-earned harvest. No one was exempt, from the lowliest peasant farmer to the wealthiest nobleman. Everyone owed a cut of their grain, livestock, and other goods to the state. Enter Senefer, a humble scribe plucked from the ranks of temple record keepers and thrust into the role of tax assessor. It's not a job he relishes, but Senefer is a man of principle and precision. He takes his duties seriously, meticulously calculating the yields of each estate and household under his purview. Armed with reed pens, clay tablets, and an abacus, Senefer sets out each summer to survey the harvests and levy the appropriate taxes. We can imagine him now, sweltering under the blazing Egyptian sun, as he picks his way through a wealthy landowner's fields. The barley sways in the breeze, the distant Nile glints like a ribbon of silver. But Senefer has no eye for the beauty of the landscape. He's too busy counting sheaves, marking down figures, and fending off the landowner's attempts to lowball his declared yield. "I'm telling you, scribe, my crops were ravaged by locusts this year," the portly man blusters, mopping his brow. "I can barely feed my own family, let alone pay the usual tax." Senefer sighs inwardly, having heard every excuse in the book. "I understand your hardship, good sir," he replies evenly, "but the Pharaoh's law is clear. A portion of every harvest is owed to the state, to be stored against times of famine or flood. Surely you don't want your neighbours to starve in the event of a bad year." The landowner grumbles and cajoles, but Senefer stands firm. He's seen the consequences of an inadequate grain supply, the emaciated bodies, the wailing children. As much as he may dislike playing the heavy, Senefer knows that his work helps to keep Egypt's people fed and its economy stable. Without scribes like him ensuring a steady flow of resources to the royal granaries, the kingdom would quickly descend into chaos. But that doesn't make his job any easier, or any more popular. As he makes his rounds from estate to estate, Senefer is met with everything from cold shoulders to outright hostility. Desperate farmers plead poverty and beg for leniency. Wealthy elites try to bribe him with gifts and favors. But Senefer remains incorruptible, dutifully recording every bushel and head of cattle owed to the state. It all comes to a head at the estate of a notoriously tight-fisted nobleman. As Senefer tallies up the man's considerable tax debt, the red-faced landowner flies into a rage. "You can't do this to me, you miserable bureaucrat," he shouts, spittle flying. "Do you know who I am? I have friends in high places. I'll have your job for this." But Senefer simply rolls up his scrolls, tucks away his abacus, and fixes the fuming nobleman with a level gaze. "You may well have influence at court, sir," he replies calmly, "but I serve the law of Ma'at, the sacred order that holds our world together. And that law demands that all contribute their fair share to the common good. Now, will you cooperate, or shall I call the guards to assist in confiscating your grain?" Faced with the choice between paying his taxes and an armed confrontation with the authorities, the landowner finally relents. Senefer oversees the loading of the estate's dues onto a fleet of donkeys, then sets off down the dusty path to the next property. It's been a long, tiring day full of confrontations and calculations, but Senefer feels a quiet satisfaction in a job well done. As he trudges home that evening, his reed case full of records and his heart heavy with the weight of his responsibilities, Senefer reflects on the paradox of his profession. He knows he will never be loved, never be popular among the people he assesses. Tax collectors are universally reviled, seen as parasites who leech off the labor of others. But Senefer also knows that his work is vital to the functioning of the Egyptian state. Without scribes like him ensuring a steady supply of resources, the granaries would run dry, the temples would go unfunded, and the kingdom would crumble. It's a thankless job, but someone has to do it. So Senefer soldiers on, year after year, estate after estate. He may not be remembered like the great pharaohs or the cunning generals. His name may not be carved in stone or painted on tomb walls. But in his own small way, this unassuming tax collector helps to hold the very fabric of Egyptian society together. And that, in the end, is a legacy to be proud of. As we've seen time and again, it was the unsung heroes, the everyday laborers, who truly built and maintained the wonders of ancient Egypt. From the embalmers to the miners, the crocodile wranglers to the tax collectors, these hard-working men and women toiled in obscurity to keep their civilization running smoothly. They may not have had the wealth or status of the elite, but they had something just as valuable: grit, determination, and a deep sense of duty. Take Ptah Moshe, the copper miner we met earlier. Here was a man who spent his days in the bowels of the earth, chipping away at unyielding rock in the flickering light of an oil lamp. The air was thick with dust, the tunnels prone to collapse at any moment. And yet, day after day, Thamos descended into the darkness to extract the precious malachite ore that fueled Egypt's bronze industry. Or consider Akencheres, the much maligned gong farmer. In a world without modern sanitation, someone had to empty the overflowing latrines and cesspits of the city. It was a foul, nauseating job, but Akencheres and his crew did it without complaint. They knew that without their efforts, disease would run rampant and the streets would become impassable. And let's not forget Ineni, the chief architect tasked with designing and constructing the pharaoh's hidden tomb. What a daunting responsibility to create a maze-like structure that would protect the king's body and treasures for all eternity. Ineni poured his heart and soul into the project, overseeing every detail from the carving of the chambers to the painting of the murals. He knew that his work would be sealed away from human eyes, possibly forever. But that didn't matter. What mattered was doing his sacred duty to the best of his ability. These are just a few examples of the countless individuals who labored behind the scenes to make ancient Egypt one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. From the mighty pyramids to the intricate tomb paintings, from the sleek bronze tools to the well-stocked granaries, none of it would have been possible without the blood, sweat, and tears of the common workers. So as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the unsung heroes of history, the ones who may not have had statues erected in their honor or their names recorded in the annals of time, the ones who lived and died in service to something greater than themselves. In a way, these humble laborers were the true backbone of ancient Egypt, the invisible glue that held everything together. Their stories may be lost to the ages, but their legacy endures in every monument, every artifact, every grain of sand that once felt their footsteps. They built the pyramids, crafted the mummies, and filled the granaries that fed a kingdom. They were the beating heart of a civilization that still captures our imaginations thousands of years later. And so, as we close this chapter on the workers of ancient Egypt, let us offer a silent thanks to those long ago laborers. May their spirits rest easy, knowing that their efforts were not in vain. May their tales inspire us to find the same sense of purpose and dedication in our own lives. And may we always remember that behind every great achievement, there are countless small acts of courage, toil, and perseverance. The everyday workers of Egypt may have had some of the worst jobs imaginable, but they also had something else. A crucial role in building a society that would stand the test of time. And that is a legacy worth honoring in this life and the next. As we've seen, life in ancient Egypt was far from easy for the average person. While the pharaohs and nobility enjoyed lives of luxury, most Egyptians toiled in difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs just to scrape by. From the embalmer's assistants who prepared bodies for the afterlife, to the pyramid builders who hauled heavy stone blocks under the scorching sun, to the brave souls who captured wild crocodiles for the pharaoh's menageries. These were among the toughest and least appreciated jobs in the kingdom. But perhaps no profession was quite as unpleasant as that of the gong farmers. Named for the sound of the wooden gong they banged to announce their presence, these were the men tasked with removing human waste from the latrines and cesspits of Egypt's cities. One such gong farmer was a man named Akencheres. Born into a poor family in the city of Memphis, Akencheres had few options for employment. With no education or skills, he was forced to take whatever work he could find. And so, he found himself slogging through the fetid streets at night, armed with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, collecting the city's sewage. It was a foul and thankless task. The stench was overpowering, a noxious mix of excrement, urine, and rotting food scraps. Akencheres and his fellow gong farmers would hold oil-soaked rags to their noses in a vain attempt to block out the smell as they shoveled the muck into their wheelbarrows. The dripping, squelching loads were then hauled outside the city walls and dumped into large pits, where the waste would dry in the sun to later be sold as fertilizer. Night after night, Akancheres trudged through the labyrinth of narrow alleys, his gong echoing off the mud-brick walls to warn residents of his approach. Mothers would hurry their children indoors at the sound, lest they see the reviled waste collectors at their malodorous work. Even the feral dogs that roamed the streets would slink away with tucked tails when the gong farmers came by. It was exhausting, stomach-churning work. By the end of each shift, Akancheres would be drenched in sweat and spattered in filth. His back ached from hauling the heavy barrows, and his lungs burned from breathing the noxious air. But it was the only work he could find to support his family. As dawn lightened the sky, Akancheres would finally make his way home, the stink of the night's labours clinging to his skin and clothes. He'd slip silently into the cramped room he shared with his wife and children, careful not to wake them. After a quick scrub with stale water and a chunk of rough soap, he'd crawl onto his sleeping mat and shut his eyes, grabbing a few hours of exhausted sleep before starting all over again the next night. It was a wretched existence, one that Akancheres would never have chosen for himself. But in a society as stratified as ancient Egypt, there were few other paths open to a man of his station. He was trapped by the circumstances of his birth, doomed to spend his life doing one of the foulest jobs imaginable. And yet, as much as the gong farmers were shunned and belittled, theirs was a crucially important role. Without them, the waste of the city would have piled up unchecked, spreading disease and pestilence. In their own pungent way, men like Akancheres helped keep Egypt's cities livable, even as they were scorned by their fellow citizens. It was a thankless job, but one that had to be done. And so, Akancheres soldiered on, shoveling muck and banging his gong, playing his small but essential part in the functioning of the great Egyptian state. Day after day, year after year, until at last his aching body could take no more, and he passed his shovel on to the next poor soul, desperate enough to take on the role of gong farmer. Such was life for the invisible Egyptians, who did civilization's dirtiest work. They may not have had the glory of the pharaohs, or the wealth of the nobles, but their labours were every bit as vital. The great monuments and wonders of ancient Egypt were built on the toil of men like Akancheres, the gong farmers, the miners, the crocodile wranglers. Their stories may be lost to time, but their contributions echoed down through the ages. As we ponder these forgotten lives, it's hard not to feel a sense of connection to these long-ago Egyptians. For all the millennia that separate us, for all the vast differences in our circumstances, there is something deeply human in their struggles and triumphs. In their hopes and fears and flaws, we see glimmers of ourselves. Perhaps that is one of the great gifts of studying history. The realization that people have always been people, no matter how distant in time or place. The specifics may change, but the fundamental experience of being human remains the same. We all love and lose, strive and suffer, just as the ancient Egyptians did. In learning about those who came before us, we learn something about ourselves as well. We are reminded of our shared humanity, our common struggles and aspirations. And we are humbled by the realization that we are but the latest link in an unbroken chain stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. So as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for Akancheres and his fellow gong farmers, for Itchu, the pyramid builder, and Ptamos, the copper miner. Their lives were hard and their labours largely unsung, but they, and countless others like them, helped build one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever known. In a very real sense, we are their legacy. The world we inhabit today was shaped by their efforts, just as our own labours will shape the world of tomorrow. It is a sobering thought, but a comforting one as well. for it means that no life is truly insignificant, no job entirely without meaning. We are all part of a great tapestry, woven through with the threads of individual lives across the centuries. And in the end, it is not the grandeur of our monuments or the splendor of our tombs that will endure, but the quiet, ceaseless turning of the generations, each building upon the last. That, perhaps, is the real lesson of figures like Akancheres and Ahmose, Ineni and Shabaka. They remind us that history is not just the story of the great and powerful, but of the ordinary men and women whose toil and tenacity make all things possible. In their struggles, we find a mirror for our own, and in their endurance, we find hope for the future. So let us pay tribute to the workers of ancient Egypt and to all those throughout history whose labours have made our world. As you slip into slumber, dream of their lives and times and take comfort in the ties that bind us all across the ages and across the globe, for we are all part of the same human story, and in that story, no one is truly forgotten. Good night. As the scorching Egyptian sun beat down on the bustling streets of Thebes, the city hummed with the industrious energy of countless souls going about their daily lives. Merchants hawked their wares in the crowded marketplaces, while scribes hunched over their papyrus scrolls, diligently recording the affairs of the kingdom. Amidst this vibrant tapestry of ancient life, however, there were those whose labours were far less glamorous. The unsung heroes who toiled in the shadows, undertaking the most unpleasant and grueling tasks imaginable. One such individual was Ahmose, a young apprentice to the city's most renowned embalmer. While his master, the esteemed Nebamun, was revered for his skill in preserving the bodies of the wealthy and powerful for their journey into the afterlife, Ahmose's duties were far less exalted. As the lowliest member of the embalming house, he was tasked with the most unsavory aspects of the mummification process. Day after day, Ahmose found himself elbow deep in the guts and gore of the recently deceased, his nostrils assailed by the pungent odours of death and decay. With a grimace of distaste, he would carefully remove the body's internal organs, setting them aside to be individually preserved in sacred canopic jars. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was left intact, while the brain was unceremoniously extracted through the nose using a long, hooked instrument. As he worked, Ahmose couldn't help but feel a profound sense of unease. Despite his growing proficiency in the technical aspects of his craft, he never quite managed to shake off the inherent revulsion of handling the dead. The lifeless eyes of the corpses seemed to stare back at him accusingly, as if resenting the indignities inflicted upon their mortal remains. But for Ahmose, there was no escaping his grim duties. He had been born into a long line of embalmers, and his father had made it clear that he was expected to carry on the family tradition. And so, day after day, he soldiered on, his hands growing ever more skilled, even as his heart grew heavy with the weight of his macabre profession. As the years passed, Ahmose's reputation as an embalmer grew, and he found himself increasingly called upon to prepare the bodies of the city's elite. The mummification process was a closely guarded secret, and only a select few were privy to the arcane rituals and techniques that ensured the preservation of the body for eternity. Despite his growing renown, however, Ahmose could never quite shake the feeling that he was trapped in a grim and thankless profession. He longed for the simple joys of life, the warmth of the sun on his face, the laughter of children at play, the sweet aroma of freshly baked bread. But his days were spent in the cool, dark confines of the embalming house, surrounded by death and decay. And yet, as he worked, Ahmose couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his craft. He knew that his efforts were essential to ensuring the eternal life of the deceased, and that his skills were highly valued by the wealthy and powerful. In a society that placed such a high premium on the afterlife, the role of the embalmer was a sacred and indispensable one. But even as he took pride in his work, Amos knew that it would never be a source of joy or fulfillment. The life of an embalmer's assistant was one of unrelenting grimness and gloom, and he knew that he would carry the weight of his macabre duties with him for the rest of his days. Far from the dark confines of the embalming house, another group of workers toiled under the blazing Egyptian sun. These were the pyramid builders, the thousands of laborers who had been conscripted to construct the immense tombs of the pharaohs. One of these laborers was a young man named Itju, who had been plucked from his small village in the Nile Delta to work on the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Itju had never seen anything like the massive structure that was slowly taking shape before his eyes. The pyramid was a true marvel of engineering, with each massive block of limestone weighing as much as 2.5 tons. Day after day, Itju and his fellow workers would haul these immense blocks up the steep inclines of the pyramid, their muscles straining under the weight. The work was backbreaking and relentless, with the scorching heat of the sun beating down on their backs as they labored from dawn until dusk. Despite the harshness of the conditions, however, Itju couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the scale and ambition of the project. He knew that he was part of something truly remarkable, a monument that would endure for all eternity, a testament to the power and majesty of the pharaohs. But even as he marveled at the grandeur of the pyramid, Itju couldn't escape the grim realities of life as a pyramid builder. The work was dangerous and unpredictable, with the constant threat of injury or death lurking around every corner. The limestone blocks were heavy and unwieldy, and even a momentary lapse in concentration could result in a catastrophic accident. Itju had seen it happen all too often, a worker losing his footing and tumbling down the steep incline of the pyramid, his body broken and lifeless on the ground below, or a block of limestone slipping from its ropes and crushing anyone unlucky enough to be standing beneath it. The pyramid builders lived with the constant knowledge that any day could be their last. And yet, despite the dangers and the hardships, Itju and his fellow workers persevered. They knew that they were part of something greater than themselves, a project that would endure for all time, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Egyptian people. As the years passed and the pyramid slowly took shape, Itju's body grew weathered and worn from the constant toil. His hands were calloused and rough, his skin baked to a leathery toughness by the relentless Egyptian sun. But even as his physical strength began to wane, his sense of pride and purpose only grew stronger. Finally, after years of backbreaking labor, the Great Pyramid was complete. As Itju stood at its base, gazing up at the immense structure that he had helped to build, he felt a sense of awe and wonder that almost overwhelmed him. He knew that his name would never be remembered, that his contributions would be lost to history. But he also knew that he had been part of something truly extraordinary, a monument that would endure for all eternity, a testament to the greatness of ancient Egypt. As Itju turned to make his way back to his village, his body aching from the long years of toil, he couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet pride. He had given his life to the construction of the pyramid, and in return, it had given him a sense of purpose and meaning that he would carry with him for the rest of his days. But even as Itju returned to his simple life in the Nile Delta, the challenges and perils of Egyptian life continued unabated. In the marshy swamplands along the river's edge, another group of workers faced a different kind of danger, the ever-present threat of the Nile crocodile. These were the crocodile wranglers, the brave men tasked with capturing the fearsome reptiles for the temple menageries and royal hunting parks of the pharaohs. One of the most skilled and daring of these hunters was a man named Shabaka, who had been tracking and capturing crocodiles since he was a young boy. Shabaka's life was a solitary and perilous one, spent wading through the murky waters of the Nile in search of his elusive prey. The crocodiles were cunning and deadly, with powerful jaws and armored hides that could withstand even the sharpest of spears. Capturing one alive was a feat that required equal parts skill, bravery, and sheer luck. But Shabaka was undaunted by the dangers of his chosen profession. He had learned the ways of the crocodile from his father and grandfather before him, and he knew the swamps and waterways of the Nile like the back of his hand. He could read the signs of a crocodile's passing in the muddy banks and the rippling waters, and he knew how to bait and trap them with a cunning that rivaled their own. Day after day, Shabaka would set out into the swamps, armed with nothing but his wits and a few simple tools. He would locate a likely spot and set his trap, baiting it with a juicy piece of meat and waiting patiently for his prey to take the bait. When a crocodile finally snapped up the offering, Shabaka would spring into action, using his speed and agility to wrestle the thrashing beast into submission. It was a dangerous and exhilarating dance, one that required lightning-fast reflexes and nerves of steel. One false move, one moment of hesitation, and Shabaka knew that he could easily become the crocodile's next meal. But he lived for the thrill of the hunt, for the adrenaline rush of pitting his skills against one of nature's most formidable predators. As the years passed, Shabaka's reputation as a master crocodile wrangler grew. His services were in high demand among the temples and palaces of the pharaohs, and he became known throughout the land as the man who could tame even the fiercest of beasts. But even as his fame and fortune grew, Shabaka never lost his love for the simple life of the swamps and the rush of the hunt. One day, as he was tracking a particularly large and wily crocodile through the reeds, Shabaka found himself face to face with the beast in a sudden and violent confrontation. The crocodile was massive, with a jaw that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell, and it lunged at Shabaka with a speed and ferocity that caught him off guard. In a desperate struggle, Shabaka grappled with the crocodile, his muscles straining, as he sought to subdue the thrashing, snapping creature. The two adversaries rolled and tumbled through the shallow water, each seeking to gain the upper hand. Shabaka could feel the crocodile's teeth sinking into his flesh, could feel the burning pain of its claws raking across his skin, but he refused to let go, refused to surrender to the beast's savage fury. With a final, desperate effort, Shabaka managed to pin the crocodile's jaws shut with his bare hands, holding them closed with all his strength as he dragged the weakening creature back to shore. His body was battered and bleeding, his skin torn and shredded by the crocodile's claws. But as he stood over his vanquished foe, panting and trembling with exhaustion, Shabaka felt a fierce surge of pride and exultation. He had done it. He had bested one of the Nile's most fearsome predators, had proven himself once again as the greatest crocodile hunter in all of Egypt. And as he began the long, painful journey back to civilization, dragging his hard-won prize behind him, Shabaka knew that he would do it all again in a heartbeat. For this was his life, his calling, to dance with death in the swamps of the Nile, to pit his skills and courage against the primal fury of the crocodile. But even as Shabaka reveled in his victory, other Egyptians toiled in a very different kind of danger, the dark, claustrophobic world of the copper mines. Deep beneath the desert sands of the Sinai, a vast network of tunnels and shafts stretched out like the veins of some subterranean creature, each one filled with the clamor of picks and chisels and the cries of straining men. One of these miners was a young man named Ptamos, who had been sent to the mines as a punishment for a crime he did not commit. Ptamos was a farmer from a small village along the Nile, a simple man who had never ventured far from his home. But when he was falsely accused of stealing from a wealthy landowner, he found himself sentenced to a life of hard labor in the mines. At first, Ptamos was overwhelmed by the darkness and the heat of the tunnels, by the constant danger of cave-ins and the noxious fumes that choked the air. He would spend long hours chipping away at the rock with his copper chisel, his muscles aching and his lungs burning with the dust and the fumes. The only light came from the flickering oil lamps that hung from the tunnel walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the gloom. But as the weeks turned into months, Tahmoos began to adapt to his new life in the mines. He learned to read the signs of danger in the creaking timbers and the shifting earth, learned to pace himself and conserve his strength for the long hours of toil. He made friends among his fellow miners, men who had been condemned to this dark and perilous world just like him. Together, they would sing songs and tell stories to pass the time, would share their meager rations, and dream of the lives they had left behind. In the close confines of the tunnels, a bond of brotherhood formed among the miners, a sense of shared struggle and shared destiny. But even as Tahmoos found a measure of solace in the camaraderie of his fellow miners, he could not escape the constant dangers of the mines. The air was thick with dust and noxious gases, and many miners succumbed to the ravages of lung disease, their bodies wasting away in the darkness. And always, there was the threat of cave-ins and collapses, the sudden and terrifying rumble of earth and rock that could bury a man alive in an instant. Tahmoos had seen it happen, had watched in horror as a section of tunnel gave way without warning, entombing a dozen men in a tomb of stone and earth. He had clawed at the rubble with his bare hands, desperate to reach his trapped comrades. But it was no use. The weight of the earth was too great, the collapse too complete. In the aftermath of the disaster, Tahmoos and the other survivors had worked feverishly to clear the debris and recover the bodies of the dead. It was grim and heartbreaking work, but it was a duty that they all knew they owed to their fallen brothers. And as they laid the broken bodies to rest in the shadow of the mines, Tahmoos couldn't help but wonder if he would be next, if his own fate was already sealed in the dust and darkness of the tunnels. But somehow, against all odds, Tahmoos endured. For months that turned into years, he toiled in the mines, his body growing lean and hard, his hands calloused and scarred from the constant work. And always, the copper ore beckoned, the precious metal that was so vital to the bronze industry of Egypt. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity in the darkness, Tahmoos' sentence was complete. He emerged from the mines like a man reborn, blinking in the blinding sunlight, his lungs aching with the clean desert air. He was free at last, free to return to his village and his family, to the simple life he had once known. But even as he made his way back across the desert, Tahmoos knew that a part of him would always remain in the mines, would always be haunted by the memories of the friends he had lost and the horrors he had witnessed. The mines had changed him, had marked him in ways that could never be erased. And yet, as he journeyed home, Tahmoos could not help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had survived the worst that the mines could throw at him, had endured the darkness and the danger, and emerged stronger for it. He had played his part in the great bronze industry of Egypt, had contributed to the wealth and power of the kingdom. But even as Tahmoos left the mines behind, the relentless machinery of the Egyptian state ground on. In the dusty streets of the capital, a very different kind of worker went about his business. The tax collector, the man tasked with extracting the pharaoh's due from the pockets of the people. Senefer was one such tax collector, a scribe who had been assigned to assess and collect taxes from the estates and landholdings of the wealthy. It was a position that came with a certain measure of power and prestige, but also with no small amount of risk and responsibility. As Senefer made his rounds, he was constantly aware of the resentment and hostility that his profession engendered among the people. The landowners and aristocrats he dealt with were often loath to part with their hard-earned wealth and would go to great lengths to avoid paying their fair share. Senefer had to be constantly on guard against attempts at bribery and intimidation, had to steel himself against the pleading and cajoling of those who sought to evade their taxes. He knew that the pharaoh's treasury depended on his diligence and integrity, that the very functioning of the state rested on his shoulders. But even as he went about his duties with a grim sense of purpose, Senefer could not help but feel a twinge of sympathy for those he was tasked with taxing. He knew that many of them were struggling to make ends meet, that the burden of taxation fell heaviest on the poor and the powerless. And yet, he also knew that without the taxes he collected, the great works of the kingdom would grind to a halt. The temples and palaces, the irrigation systems and granaries. The Gong farmers' work may have been foul, but it was critical to keeping the crowded city of Thebes livable. Without people like Akencheres and his waste-hauling crew, rubbish and excrement would have piled high in the streets, spreading disease and stench. Though the job was smelly and unpleasant, it served an essential public service. Speaking of essential jobs, few were as vital as the royal tomb builders. Deep in the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, thousands of skilled workers labored for years to construct each pharaoh's final resting place. One of the brilliant minds behind these elaborate tombs was Inini, chief architect to the great pharaoh Thutmose I. Born into a family of successful architects, Inini showed a talent for mathematics and engineering from a young age. He studied for years to master the precise calculations needed to survey building sites, design stable structures, and oversee complex construction projects. Inini's first roles were on small-scale temple renovations, but his gifts quickly caught the eye of the vizier. Soon, he was tapped to join the respected order of royal architects. Ineni's career took off during the reign of Thutmose I in the early 18th dynasty. The pharaoh, a military mastermind who vastly expanded Egypt's empire, wanted a tomb that would eclipse all others. He tasked Inini with designing a sprawling underground burial complex, filled with shafts, chambers, and courtyards. It was the commission of a lifetime for the young architect. For months, Inini sketched out ideas, pored over papyrus plans, and carefully plotted out the layout of the tomb. The design he presented to Thutmose was a marvel of engineering, a veritable labyrinth of passages and grand galleries, all cleverly hidden from potential robbers. The pharaoh was impressed by Inini's vision. "Surely," declared Thutmose, "a tomb crafted with such genius will house my spirit for all eternity." With the pharaoh's blessing, Inini got to work, organizing the army of artisans who would bring his blueprints to life. Thousands of men were conscripted from across Egypt and marched out to the stark Valley of the Kings. There they began the back-breaking work of chiseling the tomb from the solid limestone cliffs. Ineni was a demanding boss, a stickler for his high standards. He personally scrutinized every inch of the tunnels as they were cut, making sure the proportions were exact and the walls were smooth. Any sections that failed to meet his critical eye were redone, much to the grumbling of the work crews. But Ineni would not be moved. If he was to secure his own legacy, the tomb must be flawless. Carving out the tomb's hollows was only half the job. Once the dusty chambers were complete, teams of sculptors, plasterers, and painters swarmed in to decorate the walls. One of the chief painters was a thoughtful man named Maya. He had been schooled in the styles of the traditional tomb artwork and was a master at outlining scenes and blending vibrant colors. Squatting on scaffolds in the flickering lamplight, Maya and his fellow artists covered the walls in splendid murals depicting Thutmose's life and his journey into the afterlife. Lithe figures and strange gods paraded across the painted plaster in profile. Hieroglyphic spells were added to safeguard the pharaoh's spirit. Maya took great pride in his team's work, knowing these images would endure for eternity. After nearly 2 decades of carving and crafting, Ineni's great tomb was complete. It was a staggering achievement, the crown jewel of the Valley of the Kings. As the last of the workmen packed up their tools and brushes, Ineni stood alone in the silent chambers. Running his hand along the paintings, he wondered if his own name would be remembered like that of Thutmose. Would people speak of the genius architects like him who designed these underground palaces? Or would his efforts fade in the shadow of the pharaohs? Time would not favour Inanni's hopes. Though Thutmose III's tomb was built to last forever, forever turned out to be shorter than expected. Just 100 years later, the burial was badly looted by robbers. Many of the precious grave goods were stolen, and the mummy itself was hauled away to a more secure hiding spot. The tomb that had been the pinnacle of Inanni's career was suddenly just another dark and empty hole in the valley. This was often the fate of even the grandest tombs. Despite the years of effort put into them, most were eventually robbed, damaged by floods, or simply lost to the ages. Many of the men who laboured on them went to their own graves unremarked and unremembered. But their works endured. Today, we may not know architects like Inanni by name, but we can still appreciate the wonders they created. When modern visitors descend into the cool shadows of the Valley of the Kings, craning their necks at the colossal chambers and vibrant murals, they are seeing the anonymous handiwork of tomb builders from thousands of years ago. So while the names of most pharaohs' painters, carvers, and engineers are long lost, their efforts still inspire awe. The fact that tombs like Thutmose's ones still exist after 3,000 years is a testament to the skill and stamina of the ancient workers who built them, stick by stick, stone by stone. As we wind down our tour through the toughest jobs of ancient Egypt, it's worth noting that many of the skills used by people like Itju, the pyramid builder, Amos the embalmer, Thutmose the copper miner, and Inanni the architect were passed on for generations. Fathers taught their sons how to cut stone, preserve bodies, follow the vein of an ore deposit, and align foundations. In this way, the expertise behind the enduring wonders of Egypt was itself preserved. Through their diligence and dirty work, the embalmers, miners, crocodile wranglers, tax collectors, dung haulers, and tomb diggers helped maintain the stability and splendour of the kingdom. Without their thankless toil, the Egypt of pharaohs and pyramids could never have existed. So the next time you see the golden mask of Tutankhamun, or gaze up at the sun-baked blocks of Khafra's pyramid, take a moment to appreciate the forgotten Egyptians like Amos, Shabaka, and Inanni, who literally did the groundwork that made it all possible. While they may not have been mighty kings, revered scholars, or exalted priests, their sweat and skill were the lifeblood of the civilization. The inheritors of ancient Egypt's legacy aren't just the pharaohs who commissioned the great monuments. They're also the everyday Egyptians who drained the swamps, sailed the Nile, raised the obelisks, and filled the granaries, all while quietly maintaining their culture for thousands of years. And so, as we've seen, life in ancient Egypt was not always the glorious affair that the grand temples and towering pyramids might suggest. For every mighty pharaoh adorned in gold and lapis lazuli, there were countless common folk toiling away at difficult, dirty, and sometimes downright dangerous work. The young embalmer's assistant, Amos, up to his elbows in natron salt and reeking viscera. Itju, the pyramid builder, his skin bronzed and weathered from years of hauling limestone under the unforgiving sun. Shabaka, the crocodile wrangler, wrestling scaly leviathans from the Nile's murky depths. Thutmose emerging from the stifling darkness of the Sinai copper mines, his lungs full of choking dust. Senefer, the tax collector, faced with the scorn and resentment of an entire kingdom. Akencheras, the gong farmer, knee-deep in steaming waste and dreaming of a sweeter-smelling trade. And Inanni, the architect who poured his heart and soul into carving a pharaoh's path to eternity, knowing that his own name would likely be forgotten. These are the unsung heroes of ancient Egypt, the men and women whose back-breaking labour and thankless toil built the civilization we still marvel at today. They may not have had the wealth and privilege of the elite, but in many ways their stories are even more remarkable. Through their eyes, we catch a glimpse of what life was really like for the average person in this fabled land of sand and sun. And while their individual names may be lost to history, their collective legacy endures in every stone block and painted fresco that still stands today. Of course, we can only imagine what these long-ago lives were truly like. The details we've conjured, the sights, sounds, and smells of ancient Egypt, are ultimately the product of educated guesswork, informed by the archaeological record and the enduring myths and legends passed down through the ages. But one thing is certain. The Egypt we know today, with its awe-inspiring monuments and captivating culture, would not exist without the blood, sweat, and tears of the humble laborers who dedicated their lives to building it. So the next time you see a picture of the Great Sphinx or the Valley of the Kings, take a moment to remember the Amosas and Itchus of the world, the faceless multitudes who made these wonders possible. In our modern age of comfort and convenience, it's all too easy to forget the immense sacrifices of those who came before us. But as we've seen, even the mightiest empires are built on the backs of ordinary people. People with hopes, dreams, fears, and foibles, not so different from our own. As we bring our journey through ancient Egypt to a close, I invite you to ponder these ideas as you drift off to sleep. Let your mind wander through the bustling streets of Thebes and Memphis, the shimmering expanse of the Nile, and the sun-baked dunes of the Sahara. Imagine yourself as a fly on the wall in the embalming room or the copper mine, the crocodile pit or the gong farmer's cesspit. What sights and sounds would you encounter? What joys and sorrows, triumphs and tribulations? In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from our exploration of ancient Egyptian life is a renewed appreciation for the simple joys and comforts we so often take for granted. A soft bed, a hearty meal, a job that doesn't involve wrestling crocodiles or hauling dung. These are the luxuries that Ahmose and his ilk could only dream of. And yet, through their tireless efforts, they laid the foundations for so much of what we enjoy today. So as you burrow deeper under the covers and feel yourself start to slip into dreamland, take a moment to offer a silent word of thanks to the unseen multitudes who toiled so that we might prosper. Their stories may be buried by the sands of time, but their legacy lives on in every brick and stone, every painted tomb and soaring obelisk. They are the beating heart of ancient Egypt, and in a way, the beating heart of us all. And with that, my friends, we come to the end of our journey. I hope you've enjoyed this whimsical romp through the annals of Egyptian history, and that you've come away with a newfound appreciation for the incredible stories and extraordinary people that make this civilization so endlessly fascinating. If you've found yourself entertained, enlightened, or even a little bit drowsy, I'd be most grateful if you'd consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more soporific explorations of the ancient world. But for now, the hour grows late and the sands of sleep are calling. So close your eyes, my weary travelers, and let the lullaby of history carry you off to the land of dreams. And who knows, perhaps tonight you'll find yourself wandering the sunlit streets of ancient Thebes, or floating down the Nile on a barge piled high with fragrant offerings. Perhaps you'll stand at the foot of the Great Pyramid and marvel at the ingenuity and industry of those long-ago builders. Or perhaps you'll simply drift off into a deep and restful slumber, secure in the knowledge that the great wide world will still be there waiting for you come morning. Good night, my friends, and sweet dreams. May the gods of ancient Egypt watch over you until we meet again.